His first arrest was at age 17. He was, without a doubt, what people would describe as a career criminal. This was, in fact, the term that his own attorney used to describe him. During this period of time, he had about 30 months of unincarcerated freedom. During this time, he committed in Columbus alone at least 7 murders. And this is one of the most fascinating stories I've ever heard. And if you sat down and tried to write a novel, you couldn't come up with some of the same strange twists and turns that this story has. And given the racial climate of the city, the black population was up in arms saying, how are you going to blame this on a black man? It's not good. And the Ku Klux Klan decides, well, we're going to start patrolling the neighborhood. And of course, that was beyond things. And it turned out that the police chief around the 1st of March gets a letter from someone signed by the chairman of the Forces of Evil. And this fellow says, we're a white supremacist group, and we're mad that a black man is killing white women in the city of Columbus. And so what we're going to do, we're going to kill black women to avenge the murders of white women, hoping that this will pressure you to catch the strangler.
Hey, this is Matt Cox, and I am here with William Rawlings. We are going to be doing an interview about one of his true crime books, and he's got a really interesting story. I spoke with him for probably 30 minutes to an hour the other day, and I think you guys are really going to enjoy the interview. So check it out. I appreciate you guys watching.
This book is about the Columbus Stocking Strangler episode. Briefly put, during an 8-month period in late 1977, early 1978, there were a total of 9 vicious attacks in the city of Columbus, Georgia, which I'll say more about in a moment. 7 women were killed, 2 survived. There was a massive police presence, and the case went cold in April 1978. Thereafter, it was 6 years later before the suspect was arrested. He was tried 2 years after that and eventually convicted, and there was a 32-year period between the time of his conviction and the time his sentence was carried out. A fascinating tale that spans almost half a century.
Okay, so real quick, if you don't mind, where were you born? How did you always want to be a writer? How did you kind of get into this?
No. I'm a good typist with too much time on my hands is my standard answer to that question. No, I am by trade a physician. I live in a very small town in Georgia. My family's lived here for the last couple hundred years. And I went off to school and got educated and came to my senses and moved back to the family farm where I have lived for the last several decades. I practiced medicine here for a while, and I'm pretty much semi-retired now, but I've been writing for a bit more than 20 years now.
Okay. What made you think, I understand you've written some fiction books, but why did this one stand out? What made you think you wanted to take this on? Because it's a lot different writing,
Oh, it is. It is very different doing fiction and nonfiction. But, if you write for fun, you do it because you want to accomplish something. You say, I want to tell a story. And if you live in the South is permeated by storytellers. As a child, sitting around the barbershop, and watching the old men get shaved and saying, let me tell you a story about so-and-so. And Southern is traditionally storytellers. And if you and I sit there and have a glass of wine or a shot of liquor, I can sit there and tell you stories all night that are fascinating. And taking those stories and translating them into something that interests other people is really good. My first 6 books, I believe, or was it 5 books? I think my first 5 books were fiction. I think most new writers start off wanting to write fiction. I then realized that fiction has a very short half-life, so I switched to doing Southern history, basically. And this book, like the others, is actually one of Southern history. It's a very different skill set to write nonfiction versus fiction. And this book in particular, which I'll talk more about in a moment, required a lot of hard work and special skills to make sure I did it right. It's a very complicated case.
Right. I find, so I've written, obviously I've written, novels and true crime, but I think it's funny because nonfiction kind of writes itself. You have to have your prose have to be, have to be decent, but it kind of writes itself. You kind of just follow the evidence, right? Like you order Freedom of Information Act.
Well, it is. But if you simply do the facts, it's just a litany of, it's like taking 8th grade history, it gets kind of boring. You don't want to,
Right.
That kind of thing. And so what you look for in a nonfiction piece is the same as the thing you look for in fiction. That is, say, you want a story, you want a beginning, a middle, and end. You want the arc of the plot. You want the protagonist and you want the antagonist. You want the denouement. You want conflict, you want resolution, those kind of things. And this story has everything. It is a fantastic story, and it was laid upon my doorstep, and I was fortunate enough to write it.
So how did that start?
Well, there was a good writer. Mercer University Press is my publisher. They're a conventional publisher. They do a lot of academic things and a few other things as well. And there was a lady named Jacqueline White, who is a true crime writer. It's been 3 years ago now that Jackie became ill, and she was thinking about writing this story of the Columbus Strangler. She realized that her illness was progressing, and unfortunately, she died before the book came out of cancer. But she told the publisher this is a good story, and the publisher, I had written one previous true crime book. The publisher called me and said, "Gee, would you like to do this story? Would you?" I said, "Well, I'll think about it, that kind of thing." Sometimes the publisher tells you they want to do things that are really not what you like to do. And I said, I'll think about it. So I started digging into this, and this is one of the most fascinating stories I've ever heard. And if you sat down and tried to write a novel, a suspense novel, a police detective novel or whatever, you couldn't come up with some of the same strange twists and turns that this story has. And this story is true. So you've already got your facts written out. All you've got to do is craft them into a novel. And the novel is done, the book, I'm sorry, it's not a novel. The book is done exceptionally well. I believe it was the publisher's best-selling, or one of the best-selling books for 2022.
That's good. So you, at some point, you took it on. I
took it on. I took it on. It was right in the middle of COVID, and when I was saying earlier about a good typist with too much time on their hands, not only did I have too much time on my hands, there was nothing else to do during COVID. Right. I managed to write the entire book in 10 months, working 12 hours a day, probably. So,
so tell me about the book. Tell me the story.
The story basically is this: starting in the September of 1977, there were a series of murders. These were elderly white women who lived alone, and that fact is important, as we'll find out later. I want to go into more detail and tell the story in more organized fashion, but in essence, it soon became evident that there was a similarity among these crimes. And as time progressed over a period of months, it became evident that some serial killer was operating in the city. There was a vast police presence. Everything the city of Columbus could throw at the area where these killings were taking place. Despite this, the murderer managed to elude capture. And then the case went cold in the spring of 1978. And then I'll tell more about it as I talk about the book in a few moments. There's if you want me to, I can read a section from a newspaper that I found very fascinating.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. And the reason I say this is because, in true crime novels, you've got a murder and so forth. And one of the things that's so interesting and strange about this case is the terror that it visited upon the city. The city of Columbus is Georgia's second largest city. If you're from Georgia and you go somewhere else, people will say, "I'm from Georgia." They'll say Atlanta, and I say no. There are other parts of the state, believe it or not. Columbus is on the western part of the state, right on the Chattahoochee River, across the river from Phoenix City, Alabama. It's an old city, founded in 1828. It was a very wealthy city in the past, and even now there are a lot of very, very well-to-do people that live in town. It's got a population now of well above 200,000, but back in the late 70s, it was about 175,000. The population is about 1/3 or perhaps 40% Black, which is an issue, as I will talk about later. And it has an abominable racial history of racial discrimination. The city was totally roiled by this episode, and I want to read from the Charleston News and Courier in February 1978. As I said, there were a total of 7 murders and 9 attacks, plus many burglaries by this person. And the emotional impact of this is what makes it so good. So this is just a newspaper report, and I think it kind of summarizes things perhaps better than I can. Again, from the Charleston News and Courier, February 5th, 1978, and I quote, "One maniac can make a difference. There's a maniac here, somewhere, who's made Bill Parker richer and Margaret Stevens lonelier. He's made whites suspicious of blacks and blacks angry at whites. He's cost Columbus thousands of dollars and its policemen hundreds of hours of sleep. He's driven the crime rate up and the people behind locked doors. Single-handedly, the man known as the Columbus Stocking Strangler has altered the lifestyle of this southern Georgia city. In the last 4 months, 5 elderly women have been strangled in their homes by an intruder who sexually assaulted them. The 5 deaths drove the 1977 murder rate up 16%, and they caused a far larger proportion of the city's 175,000 residents to nail windows shut, arm themselves, and install new locks. Bill Parker is one of the few who has profited from this. He owns a locksmith shop nearest the neighborhood where the slayings have occurred. In just 2 months, Parker and his brother installed 7,000 deadbolt locks and sold thousands of sets of burglar bars and cans of mace. One of his biggest customers was Margaret Stevens, age 71, a retired teacher. Not only are the windows of her brick ranch home barred, but she has pins inserted in the windows to secure them. A new glassless front door was installed, and a burglar alarm system, and floodlights, and $300 worth of deadbolt locks. She was lucky. She did most of this the night before the strangler came. He tried the basement window but couldn't open it. He cut through the screens on her back porch but failed to open the sliding glass door. He tried the living room window and then left, leaving a profusion of footprints in the mud of her backyard. That was in September on a Friday. On Monday, he came back and slew her next-door neighbor, Jean Diamondstein, age 71. The thing that still bothers her, the reason that she hasn't opened her door to a soul in 3 months, is that Diamondstein had been just as prepared as she. Her floodlights were on, the telephone handy, the neighbors alerted, and there were new burglar-proof locks on her doors. So the strangler, in the glare of the floodlights on her carport, merely removed the kitchen door from its hinges and murdered her in her bed. At 71, Stevens carries mace with her to the supermarket. When she comes home at night, she has someone search the house before she enters, even the closets and the shower. Since the advent of the strangler, life has become unpleasant for a lot of people in Columbus. Perhaps Los Angeles with its hillside strangler, or Boston, which had its notorious strangler some years ago, are better able to adjust to the knowledge that a maniac is on the loose. Columbus is not so laid back. Now, Columbus is like the other urban areas, uptight. Gun sales at numerous pawn shops have doubled. For a time after one of the attacks, people nearby took to sitting in their front yards in the evening with loaded guns. One suspected prowler was grabbed and severely beaten by residents before police could arrive. An elderly lady put a shotgun blast through her bathroom window and shot a shadow dead. 2 lives have been lost in accidents related to security precautions taken against the strangler, according to Muskogee County Coroner Don Kilgore. One woman was killed in an accident involving a pistol she'd obtained, and the other woman died when she was unable to escape her burning house because of the special complex lock she'd installed. Then there's the effect on race relations. Blacks make up more than 1/3 of the population here, and their leaders say that the tensions have not been as bad since the near riot conditions of 1971. All of the victims have been white, and there seems to be a widespread assumption that the strangler is black. Blacks complain of being stopped and questioned frequently by police, who concede only that they are frequently stopping and questioning everyone. And this was in the middle of this episode of killing. It continued thereafter. But it sort of sets the scene. You get the idea of what was happening in town.
Right. So the police were continually, what leads did they have? I mean, other than,
well, would you like me to go ahead and just sort of outline the whole story?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's just start off. As I said, race relations in Columbus are a bit problematic, and that's going to be important later in the story. As late as 1971, there were race riots and arson and so forth and so on. There was discrimination in the police department and in employment and in housing and so forth. And in the running up to the fall of 1977, there had been a number of violent attacks and murders. And so when a lady named Gertrude Miller, who was a 64-year-old kindergarten operator, was attacked and beaten, raped, tied up with a stocking, she had her skull fractured, was left for dead. But during the attack, he had briefly turned the light on, and she had seen him, and she described him as a fairly young black male. As I said, she was left for dead. And this appeared to be just another murder among the many other murders that had been happening. It occurred in the Winton district of the city. You never heard of it. Nobody has, in fact. But Winton is a part of Columbus that has the nicer homes, the older, nicer homes. There are many very wealthy people there, and there are some houses that are far more modest, but it's a well-defined area. Miller was attacked on September 11th, 1977. And 5 days later, a lady named Fern Jackson she was a very prominent nurse in town. She was head of the public nursing department. She simply didn't show up for work one day, and it was found that she had been beaten, raped, and strangled with a stocking. And about 8 days thereafter, in the same neighborhood nearby, another lady named Jean Diamondstein was again attacked, beaten, raped, and strangled with a stocking. The pubic hairs found at the crime scenes were described as being probably coming from a black man, and so this led to the rumor that the attacker was black. That's given also the fact that Gertrude Miller had identified him as such. Well, at this point, the police began to say, these crimes kind of look alike. Somebody breaks in, they're elderly white females who live alone. They are ritualistically strangled with a stocking that he had gone over and gotten out of the dresser. After the killing, the bodies are covered up. And so the MO of these became very, very, very much the same. And so what happened was that on October 2nd, 1977, a black female named Bernice Breyer in her 50s was found to be beaten and raped and strangled. She was in bad shape when she was picked up by the ambulance, and she died a few days later. Her boyfriend, a guy named Jerome Livas, who was about half her age, he was 25 years old, was arrested. And there was some superficial similarity to the Strangler cases. And according to police, Livas confessed and gave details of the killing. And the police department subtly announced that, well, we've got our man, we believe that we've done it and that he did it, and so forth and so on. But, the police have a bad history in Columbus. And so Livas was a very limited intellectual capacity. He was illiterate, and by all accounts, he was a really pitiful fellow. And despite the fact that police were absolutely certain they had their man, they presented this to the district attorney. He said, no, you don't have a case. You've got somebody that you have sort of pitting the crime zone, but that's no real good evidence that this guy was the killer. So the police refused to indict him. And the newspapers at the time, which, back in those, we had newspapers back in the 1970s, apparently. And at the time, they were expressed their relief that apparently this nascent crime scene had been stopped. But during this same period of time, there were also burglaries in the Winton area. There were a lot of people that get a house broken into, which was unusual, the number of burglaries. And it kind of appeared that maybe the person that was doing the strangling may have been the burglar. You weren't too sure. And I want to mention one in particular, which occurred on October 11th, 1977. An elderly lady named Callie East, who lived with her sister, Nellie Sanderson. There were two elderly ladies. So one was in her 80s and one was in her 70s, and they normally lived alone. And someone broke in their house, but it so happened that Miss Sanderson's son was there. Okay. And there was a thing about the burglar you found out later, the strangler, is that he would, if he broke into a house and there was someone else there, a man in particular, he would not commit his crimes. He would leave. And he did with Miss Sanderson's house, but in the process, he decided to go into the bedroom where the son was sleeping and his wife. He got his guy's wallet out of his pocket while he was asleep in the bed, found his car outside, a Toyota, stole the car. And in the car, there had been a .22 caliber Ruger automatic pistol that disappeared. And that became important several years later. So you have to remember that. And this is one of numerous burglaries I won't go into any detail with. So at this point, mid-October 1977, the police says, we've got our guy, things are going to be fine. The newspapers are breathing a sigh of relief. And then in October 20th, 1977, a pitiful lady named Florence Scheibel, who was 10 days shy of being 90 years old, She managed to live by herself with difficulty. Her son checked on her every day. She walked with a walker. She was essentially deaf, and her vision was poor. Her son came to visit her and found out that she had been beaten, raped, and strangled, again with her stocking. The shoe print found at her house fit one that had matched one from the Diamondstein residence. And it appeared that the so-called strangler was there. Of course, this raises the issue of the fact that they've got Jerome Libas in jail for having committed the crimes. And so, the police said, well, we still think he's our guy, and this may be a copycat. Nah. And then that was on October 20th. Well, 5 days later, a lady named Martha Thurman, she was a widowed school teacher who lived alone. Age 69. Her family was quite concerned about her. They had come and spent the weekend with her. Her son had changed the locks on her house and put several new locks on. And so after spending the weekend, they stayed till Monday afternoon and then left. Okay. Monday morning, nobody could find her. And it so happened that Monday night, after the son and his family left, someone broke in, and again, she was beaten, raped, and strangled. The tragic thing was...
While they were there?
No, this was after they left. They left Monday.
As you said, Monday morning, nobody could find her, but you said they left Monday after, so you mean Tuesday?
Tuesday morning, forgive me. This gets complicated.
Right.
The family was there over the weekend. They left Monday afternoon. Tuesday morning, someone called her and couldn't get her to answer. They checked on her. Her house was obvious. She'd been broken into. The police found her body dead. The tragic thing is that her son had put the locks on, and he'd put the screw side on the outside. He mounted the locks backwards. So unfortunately, all the strangler had to do was just unscrew the locks and get into her house. And by this time, it became really evident that this was a serial killer. And, you had the police talking about Jerome Libas and so forth, and the district attorney saying, no, this is not our man. I've got someone at large. And at that point, Carl Cannon, who at the time was a reporter for the Ledger-Enquirer, the local newspaper, interviewed Jerome Libas in jail, and he described him as, quote, mentally slow, intimidated by authority, and easily led into saying things. So in a jailhouse interview, Cannon got Libas to sign a confession that he killed both President John Kennedy and William McKinley, that he was present when Charles Manson killed Sharon Tate, and that he knew beforehand about the Lindbergh baby kidnapping in the 1930s. And this, of course, settled once and for all the allegation that Libas had to do with it. He was still later tried for his girlfriend's murder and sentenced to prison, but he was cleared, as it were, from being the strangler. So a couple of months passed, and again, the city, if you read the newspapers, that newspaper editorials back in the 70s were fascinating because you actually found out what happened. Nobody does that anymore. They say, look online and you get 24 words. But the city was saying, maybe this crime spree has stopped until December 28th, 2 months later. a lady named Kathleen Woodruff was murdered. You're not from Georgia, and you probably don't know the names, but the Woodruffs are a very prominent and generally wealthy group of people. Her husband had been the University of Georgia football coach, which is a big thing in this part of the world. In the 1920s, there was a field, a playing field, and a building named in his honor. Someone broke into her house and again strangled her, this time with, ironically, a University of Georgia scarf that she'd been wearing. Apparently the burglar came in at night before she went to bed. She was found by her maid the next morning. So by this time you had 5 murders, and the police said, well, maybe we should do something about this. So they formed, toward the end of the year, a task force that was composed of both the local, state, and federal input. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation helped. The FBI had their input. But mostly it was composed of state patrol and, of course, local members of the constabulary from Columbus. Around this time, perhaps a month or two later, there was some killings that took place in Tallahassee, Florida. There were some girls in a sorority house that were attacked, and one of them was raped and strangled. And there was a superficial similarity between some of the killings in Columbus. 2 detectives from the Columbus Police Department went to Tallahassee, and it turned out that the killings were not related. There were too many differences, and they sort of dismissed that. As it would turn out later, Ted Bundy, who confessed the specific killing that was brought up at the time, and so that was something that also came up later, which I will address as we get further on. And then there were burglaries over New Year's weekend of 1978, New Year's Eve, I'm sorry. The burglar broke into the Ilges home, and there's a relationship here. This is the grandmother-in-law of my brother. The Ilgeses were and are a prominent family in Columbus. They lived in a large house, which was referred to as the Castle. It's 2 stories right in the center of the Winton district. And he broke in, but as it turned out, Mr. Ilges, who at the time was elderly and infirm, was sleeping in one bedroom. His wife was in the other. It was assumed that she was not attacked because of the fact the man was in the house. And again, this fits the pattern. Things were quiet again for a little bit more than a month. And then there was what was referred to as the Night of Terrors, which was the night of February 11th, February 12th, 1978. And once again, the burglar broke into the Ilges house, the castle, the 2-story house. But in the interim, you have to remember that back in these days, there were no really great alarm systems. There were some pretty primitive things. And so on several occasions, and I didn't mention this, the burglar was able to disconnect the alarm, so it didn't go off. Or if it had a magnetic contact, he would just take it and leave it up against the contact, and so he could get out. And anyway, the burglar broke in, but the Ilges had installed, it was a 3-story house, a basement level and a second level and a third level. And the Mr. and Ms. Ilges was sleeping on the topmost level. Well, the burglar, they had installed at the base of the stairway going up there, a pressure pad. So when the burglar stepped on this, it set the alarm off, and he was frightened. Okay. So he ran. The police were called, of course. And by the time they arrived, he was out of the house. But retrospectively, as we would find out, he was hiding in the bushes nearby, and went down the street to the house of Ms. Ruth Schwob. Ms. Schwob was a very prominent lady in Columbus. She was widowed at age 74. She had inherited quite well and was a patron of the arts and the museums there in the city. She had been worried about the burglar, about the strangler. So what she had done was installed a alarm next to her bed. And the idea was that if someone attacked her, she would press a button and it would call her neighbor, who was named Dr. Fred Burdett. He was a physician. Well, Dr. Burdett, in the middle of the night, gets an alarm from his neighbor, Miss Schwob, and he was supposed to call the police, but instead he said, we've had one false alarm in the past, so I'll just call her up. And so he calls her, and the phone rings and rings, and nothing happens. and said, "Oh, this is bad." She rings the alarm. She doesn't answer the phone. So he calls the police immediately. And by the time they arrive, the strangler has gone. They break into the house to find Miss Yоу'vе sitting on the edge of a bed, a stocking around her neck, coughing and saying, "He's still in the house. He's still in the house." But he wasn't. He had escaped. And again, we have helicopters at night, police everywhere, this huge presence.
He really picked the wrong demographic to go after. These are older women with means to put in burglar alarms.
Yeah. But anyway, so he got away that night, and this was like a Saturday night. I think it's Saturday, a Friday night, Saturday night, I forget. But on Sunday morning, the family of Ms. Mildred Borum, who lived a couple of houses down, age 78, come by after church to see her, and she did not answer the door. A screen at her house had been cut, and she had been raped and strangled, again with a stocking, the same thing. So what he had done, the Ilja's house, he'd attacked Miss Yоу'vе, and then he managed to kill Ms. Borum. And she was strangled with a sash cord, I think, or I'm sorry, I said stocking. She was strangled with a sash cord. So anyway, that's 6 murders thus far, and of course 2 other attacks of people that survived. And during this time, a lot of strange things happened. It was pretty well assumed the strangler was black because Miss Gertrude Miller had seen him. There were pubic hairs found that were felt to belong to an African American, and given the racial climate of the city, the black population was up in arms saying, "How are you going to blame this on a black man? It's not good." And of course, the police were stopping everybody. They had a huge force of monitoring the neighborhood. In fact, retrospectively, there was something like 16,000 interview cards that were generated during this period of time. And I've seen them. There's a huge files of them, And so the Ku Klux Klan decides, well, we're going to start patrolling the neighborhood. And of course, that was beyond things. And the police said, "You can't patrol the neighborhood." And they said, "Well, this is a free country. We're free citizens, and we're going to catch the strangler for you." Well, that fortunately, nothing came of that. But then something even more bizarre happened. It turned out that the police chief, around the 1st of March, gets a letter from someone signed by the chairman of the Forces of Evil. And this fellow says, "We're a white supremacist group, and we're mad that a black man is killing white women in the city of Columbus. And so what we're going to do, we're going to kill black women to avenge the murders of white women, and until hoping that this will pressure you to catch the strangler." Now, if that sounds bizarre, indeed it is. And over the course of about a month, the police chief got a total of 6 letters from this person, the chairman of the Forces of Evil. Well, there's a lot to be said about that, but to make a long story short, it turned out that this was, in fact, not some white supremacist. I believe that they said they were from Chicago. It was not a white supremacist group, but in fact, it was a black man, a Private William Henry Hance, who was an enlisted man at Fort Benning, which is a large military. I think they've changed the name recently, but a large military installation there, just south of Columbus. He, in fact, had killed 3 black women actually, in Columbus, and had killed another one earlier in Indiana. In total, he killed 4 women. He himself was a second serial killer operating in Columbus at the same time. He was identified. He was tried, convicted, and eventually executed in 1994. And finally, things calmed down. The last murder was in February, and there was a 7th murder on April 20th, 1978, a lady named Janet Kofer, who was an elementary school teacher. And she indeed did not show up for work one day. Someone from the school sent someone over to her house. It was obvious the screen had been cut. the police found her, and like the other, she had been beaten, raped, strangled with a stocking, and her body had been covered up. And so here we have 7 murders. We have 2 attacks where the would-be victims survive. The only thing that is sort of known is that they presume that the killer is a black man. They have no idea whatsoever who he is. And the case goes cold completely. This is in April 1978. Of course, if you read the newspaper, I mean, it's the news stories begin to fall off. The task force was eventually disbanded a few months later. But still, there was the idea that, anytime this could happen again. And of course, the city of Columbus, when you talk to people around there, I've given a lot of talks on this book, and I can't tell you how many people come up to me and say, "Oh God, I remember that," or "My mother told me about that," or "My grandmother told me about that," and I've always wanted to learn more about it. And it was a terrible time for my family because everybody was scared and so forth. It was a major point in Columbus's 200-year-old history. So. And in writing the book, I sort of wrote this first part as somewhat like you would call a police procedural. Everything is factual and very well documented because they had lots and lots of old records. But you have to recall, people say, well, what about the DNA? Well, this was in the 70s. We didn't have DNA.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, they had some fingerprints, but this was before the CODIS system, the National Database of DNA, and this national database of fingerprints. Neither of those were available at the time. And
were they at least collecting DNA?
And that's important. That's going to be very important later. In fact, both fingerprints and DNA do come into the story at a later point. But you have to remember in 1978, there was,
right.
They got some specimens they collected and so forth and so on, but nothing as definitive as either DNA or fingerprints. Okay. So that's part 1. Now, there was a hiatus of 6 years until March 1984. Okay. And finally, the city of Columbus relaxes, things are fine. And around 4 a.m. on the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning of March 12th, 1984, a 26-year-old Columbus policeman named Thomas Michael Boyd, went by Spiky Boyd. He was a 7-year veteran of the Columbus Police Department. He was engaged to be married. He was out patrolling by himself at night, and he gets a call from his dispatcher. And they said, "We have a silent alarm that's gone off at the Bombay Bicycle Club." Now, this was a restaurant actually not too far from where the murders took place. So he says, "I'll check it out." So he drives to the Bombay Bicycle Club, and just as he's pulling in, he sees a 1977 blue Dodge Charger with its lights off, screeching out of the parking lot and heading up Auburn Avenue, which is a big street next to it. See, of course, he turns on the blue lights and gives chase. And so the car runs up Auburn Avenue, which dead ends into Edgewood Road. It takes a left on Edgewood Road at a very high rate of speed and sort of loses it and sort of crashes into the yard, it's a residential neighborhood. It crashes into someone's yard. And so Boyd gets out of the car and goes over to look into the crashed car. He's got his radio in one hand. He's got his flashlight in the other. His pistol is in his holster. And when he sort of sticks his head toward the car, he gets shot twice in the forehead. But he'd called for backup before this, of course. And by the time the other officers arrived, the car was empty. Someone said that they had seen a white male exit the car and head up a creek. There's a creek that runs nearby. And so obviously police start searching for things, hoping to find this fella who had killed the patrolman. It turned out that he had been burglarizing, or actually had tried to rob the Bombay Bicycle Club, and he was getting away. He didn't get anything. And anyway, they found out that the car was registered to the girlfriend of a guy named Lonnie Botts. And she said, "Yes, my boyfriend was driving the car. I don't know where he is." So they go to Lonnie Botts' house. He lives with his mother. Starts looking around. The mother says, I haven't seen him, but they start looking in a hamper there, and they find some wet clothes, so he'd been escaping up the creek. And they also find a box for a .22 caliber Ruger automatic pistol. So here comes the connection. And so, they said, we got to figure this out. And, it's not necessarily the same gun, but, maybe there's a connection. Maybe he did some of the burglaries. So what they did, and this several weeks passed, they sent out an all points bulletin to every police force in the nation, and they got one response from the state of Michigan. Okay, and Michigan at the time, I'm told, was one of 3 states in the nation that required pistols to be registered. It was a law that dates back to World War I. The people in Lansing, Michigan, kept a big card file, little 3x5 cards, and they sorted through it, and they found this one card and said, yes, this pistol is here. It's registered to a guy named Aaron Sanders, who lives in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Okay. Now, remember, we're in Columbus, and this is Michigan. So they go to Aaron Sanders and said, well, yes, my sister gave me that. My mother gave me that. Because of possibility of burglaries, and she lives in Gary, Indiana. What is her name? Her name is Lucille Gary Sanders. So the police go to Gary, Indiana, and she said, yes, I got this for my brother, whose name is Jim Gary. And where does he live? He lives in Phoenix City, Alabama, directly across the river from Columbus. So the pistol gets traced back to Columbus. So they go to see Jim Gary, and he in Phoenix City. And he says, well, I sell a lot of pistols. I don't know. I got this from maybe one I got. And the police said, well, we really need to know about this because it may be associated with a murder, and we'll be back on Monday. Perhaps your memory will improve. So when they come back a couple of days, oh, yeah, I remember I got it from my nephew. And what's his name? His name is Carlton Gary. And said, where is Carlton now? Well, he was in one of them prisons over in South Carolina, but they let him out. And said, which prison? Well, we don't know. Well, as it turned out, Carlton, in fact, had been in prison in South Carolina, and he'd escaped. And
that's not letting him out, by the way.
And no, he escaped. What happened? He'd been in prison. Actually, this gets back to why the murder stopped, because Gary was arrested as being the steakhouse burglar in South Carolina and ended up in a South Carolina prison. That's why.
I was wondering. I was thinking maybe he just moved out of the area.
No, he decided that rather than rape and murder all women, he was going to rob steakhouses. And so he was eventually arrested, and it's a little bit more complicated than that, but it's in the book if anybody wants to read it. But long story short, he ends up in prison in South Carolina, and after about 5 years says, I've seen the light. I want to do, quote unquote, I want to do good for my fellow man. That was a quote. And so they decided to move him to a sort of a prison farm. He stayed there 2 weeks and escaped. And then, but the thing was that Jim Gary said, listen, he's back in town. He'd come back to Columbus. So where is he? He says, well, he's been doing selling some cocaine down in Florida, and he's been doing drug deals. And it turned out that he had actually been arrested. He had been arrested several weeks earlier in mid-April, but didn't have an ID and gave the police a fake name. But there is, in the book, there is a mugshot of the person they arrested as a suspect under an alias, and he was turned loose after he was arrested on a marijuana charge, and they paid a little bit of a fine and they turned him loose. And so, anyway, long story short, they didn't know that they didn't know that he was a killer. So they made a few phone calls, found out which prison he'd been in South Carolina, got a set of his fingerprints, sent it back to the Columbus police. They were looking at the index fingerprints they had from the various killings, and there's a really good scene that's told to me about by one of the officers that actually was there about the technician's response when he first found the fingerprint from Carlton Gary that matched eventually matched 4 of the Strangler killings. And they knew they had him at that point. So they went back to Carlton Gary, they went back to Jim Gary where they got the gun from. They found out that he was in Albany, Georgia, doing a drug deal. They arrested him on the night of May 3rd and brought him back to Columbus. Okay. And that's the fascinating part of the story, how he was arrested. Now, the next part is that Carlton Gary had a habit of doing things, and that is whenever he was caught, he would try to put the blame on somebody else, right?
Right.
In 1970, he was arrested in connection with a murder of a lady named Nellie Farmer in Syracuse, New York, I believe it was. Or it may have been Albany, New York. And his fingerprints were there. The woman had been raped and strangled and so forth. And he said, no, he didn't do this. He tried to implicate someone else, a guy named John Lee Mitchell. He said, yeah, I was there to cast my fingerprint, but John Lee Mitchell, he raped and killed the woman. All I did was just burglarize the place. And this is, years earlier. And so John Lee Mitchell is arrested, put in jail. He actually was in jail, held about a year before his trial. He and Gary was arrested for the burglary, and they were both in the same jail. And it said in the notes that I managed to come up with that Mitchell beat the hell out of Gary for ratting him out.
Right.
And the main witness against John Lee Mitchell was Carlton Gary, trying to blame him for this murder and rape. It turned out that there was other evidence too, which was a written note from Gary's cellmate. Well, it turned out the written note was in fact written by Carlton Gary. It's further evidence to implicate John Lee Mitchell. It took the
planting evidence.
It took the jury a very short period of time to declare that Mitchell was innocent. He was not convicted and he was turned loose, but he had a lot of animus toward Gary, which again comes up later in the story. Anyway, Gary tried the same thing here. On his way back from Albany, Georgia, he started, he was given his Miranda warnings and he was properly advised about the presence of the availability of an attorney. And he says, no, I don't need an attorney. I just want to talk. And he said, I was there, yeah, but I didn't do it. It was somebody else. So, and he goes on. Anyway, the very night that he's brought back to Columbus, he says, let me ride you around and show you everything. And so he rides around and he has all this information about these crimes that only someone who had committed them would have known. And he said, yeah, well, I was there, but the other guy with me attacked the women. And they said, well, who was this other guy? And there's a scene here in the book, which I got from one of the detectives that came back, about how he just didn't want to talk, but finally said he would admit who it was. It was a person named Malvin Allen Michael Crittenden. And, if you're going to think of a name, John Smith, perhaps, but not Malvin. Right. Well, Malvin Allen Michael Crittenden was, in fact, a childhood friend and actually had done some crimes with Gary, some of the robberies with Gary. But he didn't have anything to do with it, as it would later turn out.
He's running out of patsies.
Oh, he is. But anyway, it's interesting. And I'll leap ahead one small point. John Lee Mitchell, Malvin Allen Michael Crittenden, and Jerome Libas all ended up testifying at trial later. It was an interesting thing. Anyway, it took a jury that he was indicted for 3 of the rapes, murders, and burglaries in less than 24 hours. The prosecutor was a fellow named William J. Smith, Bill Smith, who later became a Superior Court judge. And I asked Judge Smith, why did you only indict him for 3? He said, well, they were our best cases, and I felt we had a very strong case for any one of them. But he said the other thing is we were seeking a death penalty. How many times can you execute someone? He said he felt very confident about his cases. Gary was assigned 2 court-appointed attorneys as well as a court-appointed investigator. Within a few months, he fired them and insisted that he wanted to hire his own team. He got a guy named Bud Seaman, and also, importantly, he got the noted attorney Bruce Harvey to represent him. Bruce Harvey is a well-known Georgia criminal attorney. Over the next several years, there was a lot of stuff that went on. It took a period of 2 years to bring him to trial. He was not brought to trial until late July of 1986, more than 2 years after he was arrested. During this period of time, one of the newspaper reporters, a guy named Richard Hyde, started looking into Gary's past. And there is a fascinating newspaper article that really outlines Gary's entire life. His first arrest was at age 17. He was, without a doubt, what people would describe as a career criminal. This was, in fact, the term that his own attorney used to describe him. He had never had a legitimate job. He basically supported himself by robbery and selling drugs. He had a disdain for women, although he admitted to fathering 14 children out of wedlock. He was said to be cruel and sadistic to women. He was extremely intelligent and also articulate, well-spoken, and convincing, and he was a classic sociopath or psychopath of the Ted Bundy type. He was the classical severe antisocial personality disorder, to use the correct term. If anyone is ever interested in reading a detailed description of this, you can find it on my website, which is on the front page. It says Carlton Gary Timeline at 1950 to 1984. It's very interesting reading. It's about his background. Anyway, there were several attempts to get a trial started. One of them was where they were about to go to trial, and at the last minute, the defense attorneys demand a mental competence hearing, because Gary was a great actor. Sometimes he would sit and hover in the room like this, and sometimes he would be disheveled, and other times he'd be wearing a three-piece suit. And the defense attorney said that he had been mistreated in prison, that he had been not fed, that, and so it went so on. So forth and so on. He was sent to the Central State Hospital here for psychiatric evaluation. These normally take about 6 weeks. He returned 4 days later because they said he refused to cooperate. However, the people at Central State Hospital did observe him playing volleyball and said he got along very well with other people, so it was a sham, no doubt. He was scheduled to go to trial in Columbus, and then at the last moment, his attorneys moved for a change of venue. That was another delay. And so his trial took place in Spalding County, Georgia, just south of Atlanta.
I wonder if he tried to get himself moved to the mental hospital because maybe he thought he could escape or something. Like if he got there and didn't cooperate, something went wrong in his plan.
That is exactly what everyone thought, that it was an escape attempt. He was watched closely, but that they were very well aware of that, what was going on. But it was also another tactic to delay the trial, because the longer you delay it, the less likely that the crimes will be fresh in the public's knowledge.
Right. Witnesses suddenly don't want to show up.
Actually, what happened when they finally did come to trial, there were two witnesses that were important that had died, and so there were a number of things that happened. The prosecution's case was based on several things. Number one, his admission of being at the crime scenes. Number two, there were the fingerprints of the 3 cases for which he was charged, plus one other case. His fingerprints were there, at 4 of the 7 murder scenes. There was a very similar pattern of crimes that he had committed not only in Columbus, but in Syracuse, in Albany, New York, the rape, strangle, murder, and so forth. At the time, the prosecution was allowed to introduce these so-called similar transactions. I think that's still possible from a legal standpoint. So in essence, all of the 7 murder cases were introduced, but he was only charged with 3 of them. The witness, Gertrude Miller, the first lady I mentioned that he attacked and was left for dead, but who survived, she identified him at trial. There were also testimony from John Lee Mitchell and Malvin Allen Michael Crittenden, who said that they didn't do this, and so forth. And it was also pointed out that the murder stopped when Gary went to prison in South Carolina. On the other hand, the defense accused the prosecution of lying. They said that the police had simply chosen Gary as their scapegoat for these murders, and that, in fact, there was someone else, although this person was never known. During the course of the trial, which lasted about a month, the prosecution called 135 witnesses and had more than 200 exhibits. The defense had 6 witnesses and 5 exhibits. Basically, the defense consisted of, he didn't do it, and we would appreciate it if you'd believe it. So it took the jury 1 hour to convince Gary on all counts, 3 murders and 4 burglaries. And the next day, in Georgia, we have a separate sentencing phase for capital cases. The next day, it took the jury 3 hours to sentence him to death on all counts. This was in August 1986. So that is the second part of my book. I divide it in 3 parts. And the third part is, from a writer's standpoint, you say, well, it's fascinating thus far, right? It's an amazing story of all that's happened. And you say, well, the guy was sentenced to be executed, and so you got 32 years between the time that he's sentenced to die and when he's executed in March of 2018, 32 years. And from a standpoint of someone who's writing, it's like, well, what do you do with this? It's probably going to be pretty boring. You can kind of cover it up with a couple of chapters. This was fascinating too. All these twists and turns that you didn't expect. And his case was, during this period of time, was appealed to the United States Supreme Court on 4 separate occasions, each of which they refused to grant a certiorari. I can't say that word. And,
right.
And basically the lower court actions were upheld every single time. But several things did happen that are worth mentioning. One of the things that propped up was a bite mold issue. It turned out that on Ms. Janet Cofer, the last victim, the attacker had apparently bitten her on the breast. And if you remember Ted Bundy, there was some issues about bite molds with Ted Bundy's case and others too. And there was a bite mold made of the bite mark. But it turned out that Gary had extensive dental work between the time Ms. Cofer was killed in 1978 and the time he was arrested in 1984. It was felt that by several dentists that you couldn't compare the things because his teeth had changed. The defense tried very hard to make an issue of this. There was the issue of DNA testing. DNA testing was around in the 1990s and was officially blessed by the Georgia courts in 2003. The idea being that if there's a reasonable chance that DNA will change the outcome of the verdict, then it's admissible evidence for a new trial. Well, the defense attorneys were aware of the material that potentially had DNA in it, and they had known about it for quite some time, and yet they had never requested DNA testing. Well, in 2009, there were several delays of the execution, and finally in 2009, a writ of execution was signed. Gary was headed to have lethal injection, and so the defense attorneys at this point said, we need to do DNA testing. And the idea was, so much as anything, it was perhaps a delaying tactic, or as one person said, a Hail Mary pass. Maybe it'll turn out to be something else we don't know about. So they did DNA testing, and everything ground to a halt. They managed to find 3 of the victims, 2 of whom he'd been charged with, that had materials suitable for DNA testing to compare with Gary's. One was Ms. Woodruff, but it did turn out there was not any DNA that they could get out of her specimen. One was Ms. Diamondstein, and the DNA, the vaginal washings from Ms. Diamondstein where she'd been raped, matched those of Carlton Gary. but he was not charged with that murder. And the third one was Ms. Thurman, Martha Thurman. Remember the lady who was found dead right after her family had left. It turned out she had the DNA of another man in her vaginal washings. And her family had been there over the weekend, and they had left in the afternoon, and she was murdered that night, and there's no evidence that she was seeing anyone else. And so this became an issue. And the defense, appropriately, he had very good defense attorneys on his appeals, said, listen, this is just evidence that there was a second killer, somebody else. Perhaps it wasn't John Lee Mitchell, but it may have been somebody else. And this was 2009. There were 9 years that took place, that elapsed between this and his eventual execution in 2019. It turned out, to make a very long story short, it turned out that in doing this testing, the lab, Georgia State Crime Lab, used a control of DNA, a male-controlled DNA. This was either contributed by technicians from the lab, their own semen specimen, or presumably the husbands of female technicians there. And this control specimen had not been entered in any regional or national database, so it popped up as being an unknown male. And this was the longest period of time. They finally figured out what the problem was, and they identified the DNA found in Miss Thurman as being the DNA of the control.
Right, one of the lab techs or something, right?
Yeah. And so, and that was one of the really fascinating things. Before this problem was solved, this was part of that thing. In April 1971, there was a dispute between neighbors in Atlanta. I think one person took a rifle and shot it through the window of another person. And when the police were there, they found a BB pistol that belonged to the assailant that had used the rifle. And in checking this out, they found DNA on it. Okay. And it turned out this DNA on that pistol matched the mysterious DNA on that was found in Ms. Martha Thurman. And yet the problem was the guy that had the pistol was 30 years old, and he was not born at the time the murders took place. You know, he wasn't born in 1977, so how can you find the DNA on, something's his
father?
Well, no, there was no connection at all. And so the defense attorneys had this wonderful theory that since the killings took place in Columbus, that he was in fact wearing an old Army surplus jacket, that this was one from Fort Benning that had been sold through a military surplus store, and that it had DNA in it. The pistol had rubbed off the DNA. Oh, this is fantastic. Anyway, they eventually solved the problem, and that's what happened. So without going into a tremendous amount of detail, finally a death warrant was signed in February 2018, which is 5 years ago now. And this was followed by a series of last-minute appeals, which got nowhere. And Gary was executed by lethal injection on March 15th, 2018. And one of the things that struck me about this, and there was several summaries about after he was executed, and one thing that stood out to me, he was born in 1950. In 1970, he was 20 years old, and was 34 years old when he was arrested in 1984, right? During this period of time, he had about 30 months of unincarcerated freedom, okay? During this time, he committed in Columbus alone at least 7 murders, and there were other murders that I haven't mentioned in New York, several murders. And it's amazing that in this short period of time, he could kill a dozen people at least and commit burglaries and so forth and so on. He was a very, very, very dangerous individual. So that's the case. And can I talk a little bit about the book now? Because I want to just...
yeah, sure. Yeah. I have a question. So he denied this all the way through, and even after the death warrant was signed, he never said...
Well, that's exactly the point I'm fixing to address, and it's kind of tied in with some other things. And let me just Gary was an articulate sociopath, psychopath, as it were, if I can use that term. He was intelligent. He was well-spoken. And if you look at interviews with people that talked to him, say, how could this man do this? He looked me straight in the eye and told me that he was innocent. One of the things that I came up against in writing this book was the fact that some other things had been written about it. In 2007, there was a book that was written by a guy named David Rose. David Rose is a British investigative journalist who first met Gary in 1997. He's a death penalty opponent and is convinced that the legal system in the southern part of the United States is totally corrupt and persons of color cannot get a fair trial. So he wrote a book called The Big Eddie Club. The Big Eddie Club is a social club, a dining club in Columbus, Georgia. It's been around for quite a few years. Many prominent citizens are members of it. And he and David Rose implied that this was an unholy cabal of white supremacists who hung out at the Big Eddie Club, and the conspiracy included everyone from the cop on the street to the prosecutor to the judges to the entire court system up to and including the Supreme Court of the United States. There were a lot, and like I said, the book is well written. It's interesting. You read it, you almost believe the guy's innocent. But Gary Rose has a way of not mentioning things that don't coincide with what he is.
So support his theory.
Yeah. And then there was another book written called Happy New Year, Ted, where two authors alleged that it was in fact Ted Bundy who did the killing. Okay. And then there was a third book written by a lady named Renate Solomon, which is the Stocking Strangler, I believe the name of it is, who was a landscaper there in Columbus, who's now deceased, committed the killings. And there's really no evidence for any of this. And the most cogent, most somewhat believable book is that of David Rose. But when you really look at it, compare it with the facts, they don't square up. So in writing this book, I was very much limited into what I could say. I had to be extremely truthful, extremely factual, and really, really, really seriously footnote everything. So it's the style of this book is written in a journalistic fashion. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Right.
Jack Webb, just the facts, man.
Right. Okay. It's interesting that you were able to, interview like the judge and, some of the officers, because it was so long ago, a lot of them.
Well, the judge in the case actually recently died. He came to the first book signing last year in a wheelchair, but the prosecutor who became a judge later, he turns 81 this month. Very sharp guy. Some of the other policemen that I interviewed were in their 50s and 60s and older that were involved in the case one way or the other. So I got a lot of firsthand stuff. And the other good thing I had was a ton of police records.
Right.
And so and the detail. In all, if you include the newspaper accounts and police records and the transcripts, you're dealing between 15 and 20,000 pages of stuff I had to go through. And I had a copy of the video recording of the trial, which was fascinating. Reading trial transcript is like reading a movie script,
Yeah.
And someone says it was him, but in the trial they'll say it was him. He, this sort of thing, and you get the inflection and so forth. And it was fascinating to read it.
Yeah, it's great too, because like the prosecutors and the defense attorneys, like they typically have some great things that they say.
Oh, they do. But when you're looking at the transcript, they're just kind of black and white on a piece of paper. But when you see them, he's innocent, so forth. And it was a lot of work, but it was fun to do.
So you when was the book released?
The book was released last September, and it came out in both hardcover, which actually sold out before the release date, and softcover and digital version, and there is an audio version that was released, I believe, in November. So it's in all four: hardcover, softcover, digital, and audio.
Okay. And what was your? It was published by
Mercer University Press.
Okay. I was going to say, do you have a literary agent, or you just went straight to the publisher?
Well, my first book was written in 2003. Okay. That's 20 years ago, literally. And that was when it was a lot easier to get things published. I mean, much easier than 20 years ago. The first book was extremely successful, to my great shock and amazement. So, looking back on it, that was before I learned to write. I've gotten a lot better since then, I promise you. But people liked it. The book sold 12, 15,000 copies, and it's like, oh, wow. And so then I was embarrassed after that, having written a book that seemed to be successful. So I felt like I had to do a second one. So I did a second one. It was optioned for a movie. That was good. It was about the Confederate gold. In fact, I got a call a couple of weeks ago from a reporter from the Wall Street Journal who's doing an article on the Confederate gold. And I've been on the Travel Channel and the History Channel as a quote-unquote expert on the subject, all because I got interested in writing a book about the lost Confederate gold. It was fiction. And so after a while, I kind of got a pretty good reputation as a writer. And my first 5 books, as I said, were suspense. And then I approached Mercer University Press with a serious book about Georgia history that has to do with the crash of the cotton economy in the 1920s, and nobody in their right mind would buy such a book. But I kind of wrapped it in with with a murder story. So the book is titled "Killing on Ringjaw Bluff," and it's really about my great uncle Charlie, who in 1920 was said to be one of the wealthiest men in the state of Georgia. In 1925, was doing a life sentence for a murder he didn't commit, and so he became the avatar for the small-town businessman in the 1920s when the cotton economy crashed. And it's a fascinating book, not so much for the story, but the story, it's like Eric Larson's book, The Devil in the White City. He really wanted to write about the 1893 Columbian Exposition, but he talked about a serial killer so people would read it. That's my theory anyway. And anyway, that book has done well and continues to sell well, even though it's been out 10 years ago.
Okay. Well, what are you working on now?
This book, I got so burned out writing this book that I asked the publisher. I said, let me write some mystery books, 3. So I'd written in 2019. I wrote a book titled "The Girl with Kaleidoscope Eyes," which is a fun suspense novel set in Savannah. It's about a guy named John Wesley O'Toole, who is a disbarred attorney who, when he got out of prison, turned into an art dealer. And he's one of these guys that bad things happen to, and so that book did very well. So I asked for a 3-book contract to do that, and I just fit the first of the 3 books was just now released in last month in August. It's titled Crypto. It's the same character. The next book in the series is titled The Garden of Earthly Delights, which, if you're into painting, it's a painting by Hieronymus Bosch. And it's a neat book. And then there's one more book in that series that'll be out in 2025.
Do all of your books take place in Georgia?
What is that adage? You write what you know,
Right.
I've lived here all my life. I did go to school out of state a little bit. I went to medical school in New Orleans, and I did my residency at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. But other than that, I've lived in the South.
Okay. Yeah, it's just, what is it? Is it Wayne White? I forget his name, who writes in Florida. And, oh man, there's 2 or 3 of them too. I can't recall. One of the guys he's a reporter for the Miami Herald.
Carl Landry. He's a great writer. Really is.
Yeah.
I like his stuff. And it just depends. I mean, to really get into writing, you really have to enjoy it. And I enjoy storytelling. That's what I started off this interview with, talking about storytelling. And so if you're telling the truth, as in this book and other books I've written, the story is to take a series of facts and turn them into what become a story. If you're writing fiction, you say, oh, you've got a blank slate. You can do just about anything, and the bars are the better, And my last couple of books, I'm sure I've had people, my last 2 or 3 fiction books, people inevitably say, God, I didn't see that coming, when they
Right.
last chapter, So that's fun. That makes it worthwhile.
Yeah, I find like writing nonfiction is there's things that happen that I couldn't have imagined happening.
Well, you have to really look to find those things. I mean, most of the time, somebody gets drunk and shoots somebody, and that's a murder. That's not something you want to write about. But bizarre tales that involve deception, and let me talk about the other book, earlier true crime book I wrote on 6 Inches Deeper. The thing about that book was karma, just plain karma, because the story was that in 1972, a 34-year-old mother of 3, secretary, disappeared from her place of employment. She's gone. The case again went cold in 1980. 8 years later, 2 farmers plowing a field found a buried box that had the dismembered remains of the missing woman. It finally came to trial. It had Bobby Lee Cook, the famous defense attorney, defending the person that was arrested for it. But anyway, the thing about that was the person that was eventually convicted of her crime was the son of a wealthy family. He was married. He had everything that everybody could possibly want. But imagine that you have committed a crime or something. I have this theory that everybody, me, you, everybody we know, has something in their background that they're ashamed of, that people don't know about. And if they late at night when the lights are off and they're all alone, they say, if anybody finds out about X, whatever that thing is, my life will be over. My life will be terrible. My life will be ruined. And as long as they don't find out about it, things are okay. Imagine that you had murdered your secretary, cut her body up, buried it in a box, and you're going about your life, and 10 years have passed, and everything's fine, and then all of a sudden somebody digs the box up.
Right.
And what the opening little blurb in the book is a quote from the from the trial transcript, where the witnesses asked, well, if it had been buried any deeper, and he said yes, and if it had buried only 6 inches deeper, we never would have found it. And that's where the title came from. 6 inches made all the difference in multiple lives. There were just dozens of lives whose direction changed because the box was not buried 6 inches deeper. So that's what I found fascinating about that.
Okay. Well, is there anything you feel like we haven't covered that you want to? Do you feel like I didn't touch on?
No. I write a variety of books, mainly Southern history. Some of them are quite serious. I mean, I've got an academic history of the Ku Klux Klan, which is actually quite fascinating. Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s. I've written an anthology of Southern stories about the Great Yazoo fraud and things that you've never heard of, but unless you live in Georgia, and took it in 8th grade because a whole paragraph in your 8th grade history book about the Yazoo fraud, this kind of thing. But anyway, if you'd like to know more about me, go to my website. It's simply my name, William Rawlings. It's www, then William, WILLIM, spelled out. And I think all of my books are listed there, and there's a little blurb about each one. So
yeah, I will also we'll put it in the description box so people can click on the, if you, I don't know if you watch YouTube, but there's a little box you just click on and it'll have a link.
Love YouTube.
Yeah, it'll have a link right there. So give me 1 second. And I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about this and tell me.
Well, I'm honored that you asked, and I hope your audience finds it interesting.
What's so funny is like sometimes I interview people and it's like, my wife will say, well, what do you have planned today? I'm like, I'm talking to this guy. He did this, he did that. I'm like, it's okay. But for the last week, I keep calling you she doesn't know your name. I keep saying, like, listen, there's this old Southern gentleman. I said I could listen to him talk forever. So this morning,
Botox is,
this morning I woke up and I said, I'm going to talk to this guy today. So,
well, good. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, I really appreciate you guys watching. And if you like the interview, please share the video. Do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell so you get notified of videos like this. Also, please consider joining my Patreon. It's like $10 a month. If you're interested in the book or any of William's books, please look at the description box. We're going to leave the link there. So you just click on the link. It'll bring you right to all of his books. Like he said, they're all, hard copy, soft copy, digital, and audio. So absolutely check them out. I really do appreciate you guys watching the interview. Thank you very much. See ya. Hey, it's Matt Cox, and I'm here with Collier Landry, and Collier has an interesting story. In fact, I remember watching a documentary on the story on this related subject. So as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh wow! I looked into it. I was like, oh wow, I need to talk to this guy. Like, this is super interesting. And I watched some videos. And so anyway, check this out. I was watching one of your first. We were contacted. Then I started watching one of your videos, and I was kind of like, that sounds familiar. And then I went. And as you were telling the story, I remember telling my girlfriend as we were watching it, I was like, oh my God, I remember watching this. Yeah. Like 20, like before I even went to prison, I think I watched, or maybe it was when I was in prison. I watched one of those, one of the documentary type shows. I don't think I watched the whole. I don't think I had watched an entire, like a 2-hour documentary. I want to say it was one of those 1 hour.
No, you probably watched Forensic Files.
Yeah. Okay.
Like I think everybody else has. Yeah.
So, and then I got to the part, I watched one of the shows where you actually had confronted your father. And I never, I don't know what ended up happening with that. We were doing like 4 or 5 different things at the same time. And I was like, oh, I'm going to interview this guy. I've got to interview this guy.
So that's my documentary. That's a murder in Mansfield that I made when I confront him. Forensic Files is how a lot of people know me. Mostly because I was this kid that was involved in this massive murder trial, and I was like the center of it, all of it, right? And that's how a lot of people know me. And then in my process, which we're going to get into all this, but I had made a film called A Murder in Mansfield because I did all of these things to try to find out why my father murdered my mother.
Right.
And it culminates in this, sort of scene, which is like right over my shoulder here, of me confronting my father in prison.
So, okay. So let's start at the beginning. You were, obviously you were born.
I was born. I was born.
Start at the very beginning.
In Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in Bryn Mawr Hospital on February 28th, 1978. And all my family was from Philadelphia mainline area. And I grew up, I guess, like every other kid. I guess I thought I had a really normal life. I think when we're young, we obviously don't realize what adulting problems are or the situation that we're necessarily in. So my family, right when I was born, we moved from Philadelphia to Pensacola, Florida for about 6 months. My father was in the Navy. And then we moved to Dahlgren, Virginia when I was like 1 year old. And I lived on a naval base where I grew up for the next 4 years in Dahlgren, Virginia. And my father was a doctor. My father was a doctor on that naval base. I grew up, I thought I just had like a normal life, normal kid. And it wasn't really until, airplanes landing in the backyard and going to the Chesapeake Bay and, going to preschool. And that was my sort of thing. And I had like, I was talking about this the other day with somebody. I was just filming with Vice and we were getting into like my backstory. And I was like, I do remember like good times with my parents around then. I remember really thinking that I was really in a happy family and my dad and, being home more and things like that. And it wasn't really until we moved to Mansfield, Ohio, which is where I grew up, the rest of my life, that things started to change. And when we moved to Mansfield, my father had taken a job as a president of a hospital there. Or not a president, but like he was like, whatever, he was running the hospital.
Right.
And he was a doctor, he was an osteopath. He went to Penn, and as did my mother. And the thing is that that was a place where we didn't know anyone, right? And like I said, all my family is from Philadelphia, so we were this sort of city folk, if you will. That is, Mansfield is now it's grown, but at that time it was a very small town, and it's in the Midwest, and it's they're not used to having people like we were, right? City folk in the country. So it was a lot for my mother to sort of relate to, and my father. But one of the things that, and this is, I think that something you could really understand is, and this is unbeknownst to me at the time, but it was an opportunity for my parents in a place where no one knew who we were to create a life and to sort of have a little bit of revisionist history in their lives, or just sort of create a new character, if you will. And so I think that the persona that both of my parents projected was they came from good, wealthy families in Philadelphia, and obviously we're Ivy League educated, but they sort of created this facade. And part of that facade was that we were a happy family. And I grew up spending 95% of the time with my mother. I was her constant companion. And I just kind of thought that was normal. And my father, who was a doctor, was always, quote, working. And so I started to realize as we moved to Mansfield, I was 5 years old, 6 years old, 7 years old. I started to realize that like my father was around less and less. Like he wasn't home for family meals, or he would just sort of disappear at night. I would often find him sleeping on the couch late at night, or if I came up in the morning, he was gone, or he was watching CNN, Larry King in the middle of the night. And I remember just sort of going, I don't, something's off here, but maybe not. Maybe it's just me.
You didn't hear them. They weren't arguing in front of you or anything like that.
No. So my parents did argue, and my father was a very violent person growing up. So my father had a massive proclivity for violence, but it didn't really start until I was around 7, where he was violent with me and my mother, like overtly. I'm sure he was manipulative to her. I'm sure they got in arguments and all these things. My father wasn't around a lot, and he was, quite, like I said, always working. And then I started noticing this change in the family dynamic. And I had kids I was going to school with that were children of doctors that were in single parent households. So their parents were divorced. And I didn't really quite understand how that worked, but I knew that it wasn't great. And I saw the pain that they were going through with the sort of manipulation between both parents and whatnot, bouncing around on weekends. And but I still was grateful for this family unit that I perceived that we had. And over the years, my father was around less and less. But one of the things that we did 2 things together. I would go with him on his medical rounds to the hospitals, and he would see his patients, and I would like tap dance and sing and perform for the people to entertain them, right? Because I was one of those artsy fartsy people. So we'd do that. And then we would go on ski trips, and mostly it would be myself and my father. So I learned how to ski when I was like 8 years old. We would go up, and one of the things I remember, if my mother didn't come with us, which often she didn't, she would stay in the lodge. If she did, she didn't personally ski. She did a couple of times, but it wasn't really her thing. But I noticed that when I would go with my father, it would be just father and son trip to go up there. I noticed that oftentimes I'd wake up in the hotel room by myself, or I would see my father talking to a woman. And like I remember one time going to look for my father. I woke up and I put my clothes on and was like walking around the hotel looking for him. And I found him in a bar, like at the ski lodge lounge, talking to this woman. And I was like, this is weird. But I didn't really think anything of it. As I was getting older, so 9, 10 years old, I started to develop asthma. and it was pretty serious. And I was not an athletic kid. I was on steroids because of the asthma. I started, having a lot of problems. I couldn't play in gym class like I could because it was exercise-induced asthma. And it was just really bad, right? Especially during the winter. Getting bronchitis a lot and things like that. But my father started getting really abusive towards me for not being athletic, calling me a stupid little fat boy. We would play catch in the yard, and he'd try to throw the baseball at my nuts and tell me I was a pussy, things like that, abusive things. And I noticed that things were getting more and more contentious between my parents. And there were situations where my father was apoplectic, right? And he would literally at the drop of a snap of a finger he was a rageaholic, just, everything would just hit the fan. I remember we were making breakfast on a Saturday, and I dropped an egg on the floor, and he just lost it. And he threatened to kill me and made my mother beg for mercy and slammed the door and shattered all the windows. He was just that type of person. So I also grew up in this situation where, besides the trauma that happens later, I grew up in a very contentious household of I had to tiptoe around, didn't want to set my dad off, right? And I never really understood why he was that way. And he was very Jekyll and Hyde. So sometimes he'd be really, really nice.
Right.
So, or he would have these rage fits, and then he would apologize, as most abusers, manipulators, narcissists do. I just kind of thought that was normal, right?
Right. No, I know. I understand. I mean, one, being in a very similar household, and two, I was just thinking, I was as you were saying it, I was thinking, it's funny. You don't notice you don't know there's anything wrong. I'm actually working on a story with my girlfriend, and as we're kind of going through it, and everybody involved in the story is on drugs. Well, when you're surrounded by water, you don't realize you're in water. You know what I mean? A fish doesn't know it's in water. So it's the same thing when your only reference is, you've got a sweet mother and a father who's abusive, you kind of assume, well, that's how it is with everybody. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So you realize how odd it is until you get into a normal situation and you go, wow, my family's fucked up. But
yep.
So I know exactly what you're saying. You just don't see it.
No, you don't at all. And it is a situation where you just, you can't see the forest for the trees, right? You don't know you're in water. When you're in water, you don't know you're in water. I love that. I'm going to use that, by the way. So I kind of, but still thought that I was grateful for my life, right? And my mother was just the kindest, most gentle, a beautiful woman, by the way, and just a kind person to everyone, and just really taught me the foundation of kindness. And also, my parents didn't suffer fools. I was the kid who education was a very high priority in my household. And I was a kid school would end, would get to play with his friends, get a week off from school, and then go back to summer school and take summer classes in science, art, math, whatever it was, right?
Right.
And I loved to learn. So I was into that, right? And that's how I grew up. And I think a lot of it was, I often wonder when I think back on things, is maybe my mother was trying to put me in these things so I wouldn't see certain situations. So if I'm away with friends or at school and doing activities, that I'm not seeing what lies beneath the surface of their relationship, which was my father was a manipulative, consistent womanizer and abuser. And I ended up finding out much later in life that my father was having affairs on my mother even before they got married in 1968. And they had been together since they were in high school. He was maybe 19. I think she was 17 when they met. And they had a relationship, from the very early stages of their relationship, he was a womanizer.
He built some of the nation's largest banks out of an estimated $55 million because $50 million wasn't enough and $60 million seemed excessive. He is the most interesting man in the world.
I don't typically commit crimes, but when I do, it's bank fraud. Stay greedy, my friends.
Support the channel. Join Matthew Cox's Patreon.
Things really started to change when my grandparents started dying. So my mother's mother passed away in November of 1987. Her father, who was my pop-up, who I was probably closest to out of all my grandparents, was he passed away January 1988. And he had come to stay with us at the end of his life. And then my father's father passed away in May or June of 1988. And the only person left was my grandmother, who was my father's mother. Now, my father's mother had 3 children. My father, a middle child who was my aunt, obviously, and then a younger son who's my uncle, who was my godfather, who was very close to my mother. And my mother was extremely close with her mother-in-law, because she didn't really have a very good relationship with her daughter. Her daughter was a little bit of a tomboy. My mother was a traditional, beautiful woman, into fashion, into art, into like the high society type of things, loved going to museums. And that was something she really shared in common with my grandmother. Now, both of my family's backgrounds were poor working class people, but in this town of Mansfield, they had sort of portrayed that they had different lives. They came from wealthy families and relations to famous people and things like that, which a lot of it was not true. My father also portrayed this persona that he was a naval war hero. And my father would tell these stories to patients, to girlfriends, to people of like things like going. And I remember we were at this country club that we had joined in Catawba Island, which is northern part of the state of Ohio. And I remember we were at this dinner. My father was telling this whole story about how he was in his fighter jet in the South China Sea, and he had to eject because he got shot down. He ejected, and the ejection latch wouldn't work. So the plane went down in the South China Sea, and he had to take his trusty Bowie knife, military issue, and cut his way out of the cockpit, and then swim a couple miles to shore and get picked up by a search and rescue team days later.
It's a great story. It's not true. Look, yeah, it happened.
But I grew up thinking that my dad, because he was in the Navy, and I used to watch airplanes land in our backyard when we lived in Dahlgren, and I thought that my father had flown airplanes. And this is like around the time the Top Gun comes out, so like Top Gun 87, 86, something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
So my father was very into Top Gun, and I thought, and he would tell me these stories, right? Because that was something my father was really proud of. Of course, when you're trying to relate to your father, I was like, oh, okay. And I bought it, of course. And I remember his call sign, he said, was Bumper, which was my nickname growing up, because when we lived on the naval base, I used to point to the nose cone of the airplanes and call it a bumper. I used to say Bumper. So he said his call sign was Bumper. And I remember him telling me, he's like, oh, they found my helmet. I'm going to get my helmet. I remember asking my father for like years, did you get your helmet? You get your fighter helmet? Because I thought that would be cool to have, right? I could wear my dad's fighter helmet. It's obviously bullshit. My father even told people he flew for the Blue Angels, which is like the Navy's color guard,
Right?
like the most elite fighter pilots in the world. And there are photographs of my father that he would even have in his office of him with probably more medals on his jacket, on his officer's jacket, than the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the president. I mean, it was just absurd. But again, I didn't know any of these things. Now, I do remember going to the Army surplus store with my father where they sell those medals. And I do remember getting some for myself because I was a Green Beret one year for Halloween. I think the last Halloween I was in there, but it was, I grew up in this sort of facade. But I kind of didn't believe it. But really when things started to unravel was around, my mother wanted to adopt a baby from China, from Taiwan specifically, like a 2-year-old girl. And I was supposed to go over, this is February of 1989. I was supposed to go over with her to China, and I got really, really sick. the night, like a few days before, really bad asthma. And I didn't go because I probably would have died on the airplane. And I was left with my father. And I'd never been alone with my father for more than a brief period of time, right? Or with other people around. That was 2 weeks that I was with him. And it was absolute hell. He was so abusive to me. And I remember, so my father had a real proclivity for violence, and he loved violent movies. And I remember he was watching Commando, and I didn't really like watching those movies growing up. I didn't like to see people getting shot and murdered and things like that. So I would cover my eyes, and he would call me a pussy, smack me, don't uncover your eyes. You need to see this. This is war. I was in the Vietnam War, like all this crazy shit. My father was, let me be very clear. My father was in the Navy in the ROTC program. He never was a fighter pilot. He never saw combat. He was in the Navy around when the Vietnam War occurred. He never was in Vietnam. He never did any of these things. And he never left the United States, apparently. So, but he would tell me these stories. I mean, just, and as a war hero, decorated war hero. And I felt bad, and I believed that I was doing something wrong, right? So this time, very specifically, he would say to me, he was watching these movies. I was in playing a computer game on the computer, and I'd unplugged the speakers to the computer, so I wouldn't disturb him. Literally, it was just like trying to be considerate of my father. He comes into the office where I'm playing the video game. It was like Math Blaster or something, if you remember that. And he says, why is there no sound coming through the computer? And I told him, well, I unplugged the speakers, and he just lost it. And he grabs the speaker wire, and he shoves it in my face. And he's like, I'm going to fucking stick this in you. He sticks it in the back of the computer, and he starts screaming at me. He starts taking books and computer games and throwing them at me off the shelf and screaming at the top of his lungs. Now, also, my father is 6'4", a good 225 pounds. He's a big dude, and I'm a kid, an asthmatic little chubby kid. He starts chasing me around the house, making me stop and salute him every time he said, "What are you?" And I'd have to stop and salute him and say, "A stupid little fat boy, sir," and run around and do all these chores. And he's just screaming at me. He's throwing things at me, and he's whipping me with a belt. And he did that for a period of about 2 weeks. And I remember then he would stop, and then he would apologize and say, "It's okay, Daddy, sorry," and all this stuff. Like, the master manipulator, right?
Is he drunk? Like, is he?
No. So okay. So everybody says that. So I want to be very clear. My father never drank. My father was not an alcoholic, and as far as I knew, didn't abuse drugs. Like I only saw my parents drink on very limited occasions. My mother liked an amaretto sour. I think my father maybe drank scotch, but like they weren't drinkers. Alcohol wasn't something that I noticed in my house. Now his father was an alcoholic, but he wasn't. And so he was just a rage-filled human. And so this was a time I was without my mother, and then it's this apologizing back and forth, right? So finally my mother comes back, and I'm now aware of like why she's never like let me be with my father for longer than certain periods of time. And I thought, okay, there's like some real issues here. So she comes back from China, and then flash forward a few months later, it's Memorial Day weekend, 1989. And I go with my father to this barbecue party, and we go like out the outskirts of Mansfield into the country, and go to these people's house, and they're like racing quads, and they're barbecuing, and people are drinking beer and playing volleyball and stuff. And I had never seen anything like this as a kid, because my mother was very preppy, very proper, as was my father. We didn't really like, no offense, but like we didn't quote associate with people like that. Like, they're and not that there was anything wrong with it. I had a blast, by the way, like riding a quad. But I'd never seen anything like that. Dirt bikes, all this. I wasn't aware that those things existed. I raced bikes when I was a kid. I was a BMX kid and all that stuff. Right. But like I never saw that, right? And there was a woman there, a young woman, and I had met her. Her name was Sherry Campbell. And towards the end of the evening, I'm walking with her daughter, who's a couple years younger than me, and we're walking around the lake and we're like skipping stones and all this. And I look back and my father has his arm around this woman. I was like, huh, that's kind of interesting. And we're getting ready to leave, and he gives her a kiss on the cheek, which wasn't like necessarily totally out of character, because my parents kind of did the, thing that you do with friends and whatever. But I took note of it. And I asked my father on the ride back home, I said, who is that woman? And he explained to me that she was a patient and that she was terminally ill, and that he was there to comfort her in her health problems. And that's why he had his arm around her, because he was consoling her. I was like, oh, that's, horrible, I didn't really think anything of it. That was a satisfactory enough answer for me. On school, school ends, and in June of 1989, it was Father's Day. And my father takes me to his office, and he says, or go to his office, we pick up some stuff, and he stops to go get a suntan. This is like the late 80s, so suntanning is in. And this woman, again, Sherry Campbell, is at the suntan place, just happens to run into us. And she has 2 radio-controlled cars, and she says, hey, happy Father's Day. I got these for you guys. And all this, and it's like, oh, yay. And I'm like, of course, you give a kid a radio-controlled car, you're his best friend. But I noticed something that's kind of odd. I see a ring on her finger that I recognized my mother was wearing at one point. And it was a diamond slide ring. It was very unique. Like, it wasn't a standard ring. And I said, oh, my mommy has a ring like that. And she just kind of giggles, and she looks at my father. I don't pay it any mind. And as we're getting ready to leave, I get in the car and I look up, and my father is full on making out with this woman. And I had never seen that in, other than movies, right? I thought, oh, okay, something's up. And my father gets in the car, and so I ask him, and he goes, I need you to tell your mother that I took you to the office and I gave you the radio-controlled cars, and not tell her about meeting Sherry or anything like that. I need you to do me that favor. And of course, I'm afraid of my father, so I don't want to say anything to him. But I know that something is seriously wrong with this. And I lied to my mother out of fear from my father.
Right.
So we go to dinner that night, and then in the middle of the night, I get very sick and obviously racked with guilt as a kid, because I never lied to my mother. And the next day, I'm playing with the radio-controlled car. My father is not there. And I come in the porch. I'm just so overwhelmed with guilt. And I say, Mommy, I need you to sit down. And I tell her, I say, I think Daddy's having an affair. And she
How
looks
old
at
are you
me.
at this point?
I was 11 years old.
Oh, okay.
And I say to her, this is 1989. And I say to her, I said, I think Daddy's having an affair. And I tell her the whole story of meeting Sherry back in Memorial Day. She got the cars, and how she had the ring, and how they were making out and all this stuff. My mother said, thank you for telling me. She was upset that I had lied to her, but she was thankful, and she understood why my father put me in that position, and it wasn't fair to me. And she's grateful that I told her the truth. She goes in, she makes a phone call, and it's a lot of screaming. And that was when I realized that, like, oh my God, like some of these other kids, I'm going to be a child of divorce. I don't have this I don't have this perfect family that I thought I had. Despite my father's behavior, and despite my father not being around all the time, I still thought I had a family unit intact. And I realized that that's not the case. So this is, like I said, end of June 1989. And this is when things really started to unravel. So my parents start to engage. My mother files for divorce, because unbeknownst to me at that time, my mother and father had an understanding, which was, my mother had said, my father's name was John, but he went by Jack. She's like, Jack, you can do whatever the fuck you want. Don't involve our kid. The moment you involve our kid, that's the line in the sand. And he did. He involved me by introducing me to one of his girlfriends. And that was it for my mother. And she'd filed for divorce. And for the next several months, it was getting really ugly. And my father would leave little notes in my bed saying, I love you, buddy, and everything will be okay. And daddy, like basically the victim, like mommy's doing this, but mommy will come to her senses type stuff that he was saying this. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't know what's going on, but like, it seems like you're at fault here, buddy. And because my mother was my most important person to me. I spent, like I said, the majority of my time with her. But it kept getting uglier and uglier. And my father, if anytime when I would spend time with my father at this point, this is towards the end of 1989, we would randomly run into Sherry Campbell, and he'd be like, "Look who's here! It's Sherry." We were at a Kmart, and she just conveniently, we would just.
Sherry was sick.
Yeah, exactly.
Sherry was going to die.
I thought Sherry was. Oh, now
ill.
she's definitely not terminally ill.
No, okay.
And because she's still around. So that was a lie. And what happened is that we randomly run into her, and he was like moved in with her or staying there. He wasn't at our house hardly at all. He would come back and get things, and things were just really, really ugly between my parents. And my father gets nastier and nastier. And this is like around Thanksgiving of 1989. My father's telling me things like he's going to make sure, because I believe my mother finally filed for divorce in November of that year, November 1989, officially. And my father started telling me how he's going to make sure that I get yanked out of the school that I'm at and go to public school, like all the other, quote, poor kids. And he's going to make sure that my mother and I don't have a house to live in, that he's going to make sure that my mom is working at McDonald's, and that I don't have enough clothes, and that we suffer. And that's how I'm going to grow up. And he's going to create a beautiful, wonderful life with Sherry and her children and give them everything. This is what he's telling me as an 11-year-old child. And I started noticing my mother's demeanor was really beaten down, because unbeknownst to me also was the fact that my father is a doctor, but the whole reason that my father is a doctor is my mother, who graduated from the University of Pennsylvania School of Dentistry and got her dental hygienist degree, was working in Philadelphia in the 60s and 70s, earning $25 an hour to put my father through medical school. And my mother ran all of his books and took care of all the accounting for my father's practice, because my father went into private practice after he left the hospital because he was asked to leave because of his womanizing and because he had so many complaints against him, which of course I didn't know any of this as a child. So my father starts telling me all these horrific things. So my mother is driving me after picking me up to school. We're going to a restaurant called Bob Evans to eat. And she says to me as we're driving down the road, she says, "Collier, I want you to know something. I would never leave you." And I was like, "Well, of course not, Mommy. I know that." And she goes, "If I ever do, I want you to know that your father probably had me killed." And I was like, "Well, how is that, Mommy?" And she starts going into this fact that, so my father's Italian. And she said, "Your father has mafia connections, and, your father just has ways to dispose of me."
Well, I mean, who knows if that's even true?
Yeah.
Based on all the other, who knows what he's telling her?
Exactly. And, my mother did know, I ended up finding out eventually, like my mother did know my father's family, and there wasn't these connections, like at least not that way. But she was just in fear of her life. And I had kind of seen that at that moment, like, okay, something's up. So the holidays are here, and it's just not a great holiday. Christmas, my father isn't around, like he's with his new family, buying them all kinds of presents and stuff like that. And it's just a whole thing, right? And my grandmother, who's my father's mother, was supposed to come stay with us for Christmas and have a wonderful holiday. She doesn't come for Christmas. She instead comes for New Year's. And she arrives on New Year's Eve, or December 30th, 1989. And what's interesting is my mother, when they were arriving, she saw my father drive down the driveway, and we could see my grandmother was in the car. And she said to her best friend, who she was on the phone with, "Well, Jack's here with his mother, so I guess he can't kill me tonight." And the irony of all this is that my mother used to say things like famous last words. My mother had a very sardonic sense of humor.
Right.
So, she used to say like famous last words, but famous last words. So my grandmother arrives, we have dinner, whatever. My father leaves, and my grandmother and my mom are sitting in the living room, and I give everybody a kiss goodnight. I give her a hug. Night, mommy. Next thing I know, I'm startled awake by hearing a scream. And I look at this clock. I have this Batman clock on the wall, and it's about 3:18 a.m. And then I hear two loud thuds about 60 seconds apart. And between those thuds, I hear my father muttering. I recognize his voice. And then I count 12 footsteps as they walk down the hallway. And I always slept with my door open. And in the doorway, I can see out of my peripheral vision, the 2 feet stop in my doorway. And something's telling me, don't look up. Because I firmly believe that if I had, at that point in time, it's nothing to make the hole a little bigger and say she left with the kid.
Yeah. Because that's actually probably more plausible.
100%.
100%.
And the footsteps go away. I somehow go back to sleep. I wake up a few hours later. I jump out of bed. I run straight to my mother's room, and there's a bunch of sheets that are off the bed. It's in disarray, and I'm looking for blood stains. I'm looking for anything I can find. I come downstairs, and my father is sitting on the couch watching CNN with a towel wrapped around his waist. I said to him, "Where is my mother?" And he doesn't respond right away. So I said to him again, I said, "Where is my mother?" And he looks at me and he goes, "Well, Collier, mommy took a little vacation." And I knew at that moment it was game on, motherfucker. Like, you fucking killed her. But I don't really want to believe it, but I'm like, this is what's happened. So my grandmother comes in, and my father says to me, okay, so we're not going to contact the police. We're not going to contact the FBI. And I thought that was really bizarre when he said the FBI. Because I'm like, what? Like, we're in Ohio, like at the FBI. And he goes into this whole story of explaining that the thuds that I heard was my mother throwing her purse at him, and that she had come downstairs and attacked him and started screaming at him over the divorce, over money, and threw her purse at him, threw all her credit cards at him, left the house, walked down the driveway in the dead of winter with no coat, and got into a car that was waiting for her at the end of the driveway and left.
Uber?
Yeah, 1989.
Yeah.
She pulled up her iPhone and got in the Uber.
That whole story doesn't make in a town where I don't know very many people, in the middle of the night, without my credit cards, without anything, without a
coat.
Yeah. And left her personal vehicle there.
Left her personal vehicle there, left her children there, didn't grab the kids, just left.
Right.
And so that's already very fishy.
Right.
And I know my father is lying, right? Because once he involved me with the sherry, with the mistress, I started realizing that all the shit that my father had told me my entire life was all bullshit. Like, my father was a liar. And I was like, okay, so this is the type of person I'm dealing with. So I became even closer to my mother during this time, between when I discovered that he's a womanizer and has this relationship, to when she goes missing. So our bond only gets stronger because now I believe my mother. I believe, and I see the pain that my mother's going through in this whole divorce and separation and divorce. And I'm just like, this guy's a horrible fucking human being. My father's I've already didn't really care for my father to begin with. And now I'm like, you're a fucking asshole. And now my mother's gone. And now you're feeding me this bullshit. So my father leaves. And my grandmother, who's there, and she's bought the whole story, and she's like, okay, you're not going to call anybody. You're not going to tell anybody, because he don't want us to tell anybody. I'm like, yeah, that's fucking ridiculous. So my mother had just bought
It doesn't make sense. Like, you're going to try and track her down at the very least.
Of course. And what I do is my mother had just bought a cordless phone. I grab this cordless phone. I go upstairs, and I had saved all my mother's friends' phone numbers. And I had hidden them in a Garfield that I had in my room. I grab that list. I go into the bathroom. I lock the door. And I start calling everyone. I tell them what happened. I tell them, I can't call the police. I told my father I wouldn't call the police. Call the police.
Right.
So a black and white shows up at the house a few hours later. And two, uniform officers come in, and my grandmother is just livid with me, screaming at me, saying, your father just said not to call the police. Why did you call the police? I was like, I didn't call the police because I didn't call the police. And they're coming around, but my grandmother is literally helicoptering. She is hovering over everything. She's telling them to get out of the house. You don't have a right to talk to this kid, blah, blah, blah. And I'm trying to explain to them, my mother would never leave me. Like something has happened to her. This is the bedroom. They're just kind of looking around or whatever. Turns into a missing persons report. So I follow up the next day with my mother's friends, and they say, this is a missing persons case. We filed a report. I'm like, well, it's not she is missing, yes, but something has happened to her. She's dead, or she's locked in a room somewhere. And and they all knew that my mother would never leave me, because my mother did have friends in town, other doctors' wives and stuff. I had friends growing up, but she didn't have a family here, and the family was all back east, and they were also very estranged, especially after my grandparents passed away, which I'll come to find out later why. But so the next day, so we have this it's New Year's Day by this time, and my father's girlfriend shows up, and we have this whole pot roast or pork roast dinner. It was just terrible. But earlier in the day, what happened is the detective showed up, and his name was Dave Messmore. Knocks on the door. My grandmother again is like, you can't come in. You can't do this. And he's like, well, I just want to, have a word. Is the doctor here? No, he's not here. He'll come back later. He's like, well, mind if I just have a look around? He charms his way in. And I'm like, come on in. So my grandmother again loses it, and she goes to call my father on the phone. I grab him. I pull him aside, and I say, give me your card. My mother would never leave me. Something's happened to her. Give me your card. I'll contact you. I'm going back to school. He gives me his business card. The next day I go to school, the first thing I do is I walk into the principal's office. I give her the card. I say, you need to call the Mansfield Police Department. You need to call this guy. You need to get him here. Dave Messmore comes down to my school, and over a period of 2 or 3 hours, I lay out the entire history of my mother and father and everything that happened, from the whole situation, and the girlfriend, and all the details, meeting her, my father's abuse towards me, my mother, what really happened on New Year's Day, on New Year's Eve, and what I heard, and everything. And I tell him, I said, I'm going to go home because my father won't be home. My grandmother will be dealing with my sister, who was adopted from Taiwan. I said, I'm going to go upstairs and pull the bookshelves out of the wall and look into our crawl space to see if I can find my mother's body. Or I'm going to start looking for clues. I'm going to see if I can find her one purse that she would never leave the house with. I'm going to see if I can find this. And I just started laying out what my sort of plan was. And I think he was looking at me like I was fucking crazy. At the time, I'm almost 12 years old, but I'm still 11. He's like, this kid, but I was a very articulate child, and growing up with parents that really valued education. I wasn't watching television and stupid shit. I was reading books, and I would read my father's medical books for fun. And our idea of going on a family vacation was to go see all these museums and everything. So education had a really high priority in my household. So I was a well-spoken little kid, and I begin to gather evidence against my father. And over the course of the next 25 days, and today is a very, very key anniversary date, January 25th for me. But over the next 25 days, I start gathering evidence, and myself and Dave Messmore begin to put together, and ultimately it leads to my father's arrest, which is on January 25th, 1990. But I start gathering evidence, and some of the things that are happening is my father's coming home, and he has all these marks and cuts on his hand. So I report that. He is really sore, and he has me rub Ben Gay on his shoulders because he was so sore. And he said from moving boxes in his new practice in Erie, Pennsylvania. And I'm just telling the detective everything as all this is transpiring over the next several weeks. But it wasn't until mid-January 1990, my father takes me to his office to go pick up some paperwork. And I'm watching my father like a hawk, so I don't let him out of my sight, right? And every night, like during this time, his divorce attorney is over at the house. Dave Messmore keeps coming to the house with other officers do to want to talk to my father. He wants to question my father, but he refuses to talk to him. And I see Dave at the doorway, and mind you, I'm talking to Dave behind my father's back at school, reporting on everything that's going on inside the house. And it's like we have this like thing, and he's pretending not to know me, and I'm pretending not to know. It was really weird. It was crazy. But what happens is I go with my father to get this paperwork in his office, and on the drive back, we stop at a gas station. He walks in the gas station to purchase some stuff and pay for gas. And I'm watching him through the windshield. I start rummaging through his car. I open up the center console of his truck, and I find 2 photographs right next to each other. One is of a house that I've never seen before, and the other one is of his girlfriend, Sherry Campbell, with her 2 children sitting in front of a fireplace that's wrapped in plastic, so it looks like a new fireplace. And I just kind of put 2 and 2 together. Like, this is a new house. She's involved. This is something significant. So next day I go to school and I tell Dave Messmore about this. Towards the end of January, so around January 21st, 1990, because I don't hear from Dave after telling him about this house for a couple of days, I notice my father's behavior he's becoming more and more stressed at home. But oddly, my father is not angry. My father has turned actually into this sort of very passive person in a lot of ways, where I was playing a video games. I got a Nintendo for Christmas that year. It was a fighting game, and he saw me playing it, and he goes, "I didn't know this was a violent game. I wouldn't have bought it for you." And I'm thinking to myself, who is this guy? Like, you're Mr. Violence. You're I cover my eyes when you're watching Commando and you're angry with me, and I'm playing a beat 'em up Double Dragon game, and this is what you're upset about. I was like, this is so bizarre. But my father comes to me, it's around January 21st, 1990, and he says, Collier, I know it's been really hard on you, with your mother leaving us. It was always with him over the course of this sort of investigation. It was everything that he would tell me was, "Oh, your mother left us. Your mother left us. Hopefully she'll come back." We would pray at meals at night for her safety. I mean, it was wacky shit. And I said, I was like, okay. And he said, "Well, I want to take you on a like, let's just do a father and son bonding trip. And I have a medical conference in Florida, and I'll take you, and we'll have just a father and son bonding trip, and it'll be really great." And I'm thinking to myself, okay, man, every year we would go to Tampa, Clearwater Beach, and we would go for medical conferences. But they were always in the spring. They weren't in the middle of January, end of January. They weren't right after Christmas, because obviously these things are structured to, like, families can go on spring break and the kids can go busch gardens and whatever, and it's a fun trip, right? It's Clearwater. And I knew something was up, and the next day I tell Dave Messmore, I call him up and I said, "This is what's happening." And he realizes, like, because I tell him, I was like, "I'm going to drown in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm not coming back from Florida." And he knew that. And as potentially the only key witness in a murder case, he was very concerned. Okay. So the morning of January 24th, I get yanked out of my house. I wake up. What's that?
Question?
Oh yeah, of course. So, please interrupt me.
Is this a year later?
No, this is a few weeks later.
A few weeks later. So it hasn't been a year. Okay.
No, so this has been, so my mother goes missing on December 31st, 1989. This is now like January 24th, 1990.
Okay. I thought maybe because, a lot of times
sure,
homicide detectives or cases, they take forever.
Of course.
So,
and which is very interesting, because now that seems to be the process. But this was not the case with my father. So what had happened is, and like I was saying, my father's behavior was he was more and more passive. He wasn't getting aggressive, but he was very nervous. So I began to think, okay, I tell Dave Messmore, I've been telling Dave Messmore all this stuff. And then, so they yank me out of the house. Children's Services comes in. They say, "We're from, Child Services. You have 20 minutes to pack a bag and get your stuff." And so I start packing my clothes, and I say, "Okay, what about my dog?" And they say, "We'll come back for your dog." I never saw my dog again. Yeah. I pack a bag for my sister. As I'm coming down the stairs is when I discover the entire house, and my grandmother's screaming at these people. The entire house is filled. They're coming in with men and women in white coats, and they've got all kinds of contraptions with them. Like they're executing a search warrant in my house for my mother's body. And it was complete mayhem. I get taken to a friend of the family's house, and I'm not going to school that day. I go and I'm approached by a social worker comes, and I don't know what a social worker is, a caseworker, but I know it's not a good thing. And she basically explains to me, I'm going to be staying here for a while. I won't be going back to my home for a while. And they're looking for my father. And I'm like, okay. So that night, which is January 24th, 1990, I have what is literally the worst asthma attack of my life. And I'm pretty convinced that I'm going to die. And I'm in a home. I don't have my medication. I don't have the stuff that I need to breathe, really. I don't know how I made it through the night, but I did. Next morning, they take me to the hospital because I somehow stabilized. They take me to the hospital, and I go to see a family friend who's a doctor. And as I'm walking into the hospital, the lobby is filled with people, and there's an honor box. Honor box is where they have the newspapers. And as we're walking towards it, I get kind of veered away from it. And we go into the room, and the doctor's there. He gives me an injection for steroids. I get a breathing treatment, and I'm like, okay, I can finally breathe. And this is January 25th, 1990. And this is when they tell me, they say, Collier, Lieutenant Messmore found your mother. And then there's like this eternal pause. And she was dead. And the first thing out of my mouth was that bastard. And then that's when the circus starts.
So I have a question. Are you still, you're 11?
I'm 11, almost 12.
So were you still holding out hope that maybe she was alive, or you just kind of knew?
I knew, but
Right.
in that moment, man, like you have that, like you have this little like glint of hope in you that maybe what you really know to be true is really not true. Like they're going to say, Lieutenant Messmer found your mom. She was, she was vacationing in the Bahamas. She was in Aruba. She was shopping in Toronto, and she this and that. She was, you kind of hope that it doesn't have the ending, because nobody wants to think that their mother has been murdered,
Right.
and their mother has been murdered by their father.
Right.
So my father, they leave me out of this room, and of course I see the honor box, which is Boyle arrested for wife's murder, wife found, on the headlines. And this was January 25th, 1990, so 33 years ago. And I'm just like, and I already knew that my life was altered. But I was like, this is like, I've officially crossed the Rubicon now. Like my whole life is over as I know it, like completely over. And I just, it's really hard to explain, or it's really hard to articulate the emotions that come through that. And I think, for you, maybe you can relate on a totally different level, but I think, you were convicted you went to prison for 12 years, right?
Yeah. Almost 13 years. Yeah.
Yeah. And you obviously you committed a crime. You knew you were guilty. We talked about that, but there's a finality when somebody, like when the judge, when the judge says your sentence, right? You're sentenced to however many, you did 12, 13, but maybe it was like 20 years and you were out for good behavior or whatever it was, right?
Right.
But when you hear those things, like you officially know, like, okay, it's no joke. This is like reality is set in. Like there's no coming back, right? I mean, I'm sure you had that experience,
right?
Despite your guilt, like it still hits you like, oh, this is real. Like it puts a button on it, right?
Right.
So I feel like, I mean, I didn't know exactly what was going to unfold, but it was a circus. So I go into the foster care system temporarily. I'm staying with friends. Actually, I'm not even in the foster care system yet. I'm temporarily staying with friends. My mother's mother comes in town. Or my mother's sister, my Aunt Carol, comes in town. They have a memorial service with my mother's friends. And I testify at the grand jury hearing to indict my father, tell them everything I know, and I help them secure his indictment for my mother's murder.
Did you know, I'm sorry, did you
No,
know
go ahead.
any of the details at that point? Like, did you
I just knew.
out?
So I knew a few things because they started asking me questions about, have you ever seen a blue tarp
Right.
around? And I said, yeah, it was on our porch. Anything else? Oh, there was this green indoor outdoor like AstroTurf carpeting that my dad had rolled up on the porch for months in 1989. They started asking me, have you ever seen this? I was like, yeah, I saw this. Yeah, I saw indoor outdoor carpeting. Now, I didn't know the details of what they had found, but what had happened is while I'm having the worst asthma attack of my life the night before, on January 24th, they are excavating my mother's body from underneath the basement floor of this house that I had found the photographs of that my father had purchased with his mistress, Sherry Campbell. And they dug up her body underneath the basement floor, and it was covered with green AstroTurf. There was new bookshelves, and they almost didn't discover it. They just happened to see a splatter of concrete on the wall that wasn't cleaned up, and then they knew that the floor had been excavated. And they ripped everything up, and then that's how they dug her body up. And it was wrapped in a blue tarp, which I saw for months just sitting on our porch. So the charge was premeditated murder because my father had planned all of this for months.
Right. He'd bought all this equipment, set it out. So this wasn't like a tarp that you had for 10 years for painting one time. This was, he went out and started collecting, bought the house, or
yes,
had a whole plan.
all of it. And so I testify at the grand jury, and a couple of things happen. State's like, okay, we're going to go with somebody, right? My father's side of the family wants nothing to do with me because they feel very strongly that I'm the reason why my father's arrested. And they're under this, spell of my father, who is a psychopath and a master manipulator and narcissist, that he's innocent. And now I have somehow involved police and dishonored the family, and I'm the bad guy at 11 years old. My mother's side of the family,
even though the body ends up in his mistress's basement.
No, it's not his mistress. It's his house that he bought with her. And she she wrote her name as, so her name is Sherry Campbell. She's not married to my father. My father's name is Dr. John Boyle. He's still married to my mother. She writes on the documents to purchase the house, Sherry Boyle. And then she puts an N period, because my mother's name was Noreen Schmid Boyle. So the initials line up NSB. Right. So if anybody ever checks, it looks like that. Right. Because nobody knew what my mother's middle name was, really. So it's this whole thing. So everything was very calculated. And he even asked, and it comes out in trial later, he even asked the real estate agent about lowering the basement floor in this house, which was brand new, by the way, about lowering the basement floor, but it was at the lake level. So you can't really get underneath the floor too much because of the water level. It'll fill with water. Right.
Right.
So it ends up being it's a fiasco. So my father's side of the family wants nothing to do with me because they feel that I'm the whole reason that this is all transpired and my father's innocent. My mother's side of the family, my godmother, says to me verbatim, this is my mother's sister, we cannot take you in because you look like your father.
Okay.
So I was...
There's a whole bunch of really, really logical people involved.
Very, very logical and rational people involved in this entire situation. And it's a very peculiar situation to be in when you are the youngest person in this scenario, yet you are the adult.
Right.
And I'm just dumbfounded. I'm completely devastated. that my family has nothing to do with me. And I go into the foster care system, which I don't know if anyone understands the foster care system in the United States or how it works, but it's fucking horrible. Despite the circumstances in there, it's just it's not great. And I basically have to, while in foster care, come to terms with the fact that my father has murdered my mother. He's about to go to trial. I'm the key witness in this trial. And even though prosecutors said to me, well, we don't need you to testify if you don't want to. You don't have to testify. I was like, over my dead body. Because, when it goes to trial, I'm 12 years old. So I turned 12 a month after all this happens, after they dig the body up and I'm in the foster care and all this stuff, right? And I really, in the nadir of my life, have to somehow find the courage and the strength to go, okay, I'm going to do what's right. I've been doing what's right for the last several months for my mother, for my family, and I'm going to tell the world what I know and face this monster in court. And a lot of people were under the impression that it was like videotape testimony, like you phone in. No, I was in the courtroom. And the videotape is because they were filming me in court for the news, because the trial was televised live throughout the courtroom. And it was such a circus that the courtrooms filled up every day. It was like the hottest ticket in town. And so they had to put television monitors out in the hallways of the courthouse so people could line up to watch the trial. And of this doctor, who murdered his wife. And my father had a high-powered legal team and all these things. And, for that time, right, there's no Johnny Cochran, but like for Mansfield, he had a high-powered legal team. And I just thought to myself, like, the thing is that you have two choices. You can do the difficult thing, which is tell the truth, face this monster, and honor your mother and do what you know is right, or you can do nothing. And I realize, and I don't know how I realized this, but this is all a testament to my mother and how her upbringing and what she instilled in me. But I realized that if I didn't do any of this, there's going to be two things that were going to happen. One, decades later, when I'm looking at myself in the mirror, I wouldn't be able to live with myself. Second thing is, if my father somehow gets acquitted and I don't do anything, I'm not going to be able to live with myself. But also the scary reality is when you're testifying against your father and you have somebody who has this type of behavior, if he gets acquitted, he's going to, my life is over. My life is already over, but now my life is over again. and I'm going to be reliving this nightmare every single day of my life. Hey, remember when you tried to put me in prison for murdering your mom? Oh, by the way, I did it because there's no double jeopardy. It could be something as simple as that. So I just, it's a really hard thing to face, but I did it. And I said, I'm going to do what's right. And I'm going to go in there. And I testified for 2 days at trial against my father. And he is still incarcerated to this day.
Right. But you still have, how much time did he get?
So he got 20 years for aggravated murder, which is premeditated murder in Ohio at that time. And then 1.5 years for abuse of a corpse. But he's on old law, so every time that he wants to be released, he has to go before the parole board and plea his case, and then they can give him more time. It's not like a 20 years and you're out type thing.
What do you mean give him more time? You mean he goes to the parole board and they don't let him out on parole?
Exactly. And they keep him inside again.
Okay.
Nowadays, the system has changed, from my understanding, is where if you're charged with a crime, they just give you a flat rate. So it's a one size fits all. Okay, you committed this crime, then this is what you're going to, and on 20 years and 1 day you're out, and you're on probation, right? That wasn't occurring when he was sentenced. So he's still incarcerated, 79 years old.
when he goes in front of the parole board, does he still say, "Oh, I'm innocent, shouldn't be here," or does he say, "I fucked up"? What does he do? What does he say?
So I had a relationship with my father for decades because, and I guess we can get into this, but from what I understand is, he still is in denial of it, or he's responsible for her death. But finally in my film, when I finally confront him, because I grew up in this town and I was known for this, and I did not want that. I didn't want anyone to know me for anything but who Collier is. And so I basically went off to music school for a few years, dropped out, and moved to Los Angeles because I wanted to tell this story. And I was either like, okay, I'll become a rock star, become famous, and tell my story and change the world and help people. Or I'll become a filmmaker, I'll tell my story, change the world, help people. And that's what I ended up doing. I ended up becoming a filmmaker. And this whole process for me was trying to understand why my father murdered my mother. So in my film, A Murder in Mansfield, I confront my father for the first time. And I've had, I had a relationship with my father. I come to visit him in prison all the time, and over the phone calls, and I have 400 some letters, and I read them on my podcast, Moving Past Murder, to expose like narcissism and gaslighting and things like that. Right. But this was the first time I've ever put it to him, like, you murdered my mother and I want to know why. And he has this whole story of just that she came down the stairs and she confronted, much like he told me in that morning, but he left out, but he now added the details of he pushed her, she hit her head on a piece of furniture. And when he came back to her body, she wasn't breathing and he tried to give her CPR. Now, mind you, he didn't call 911 or anything like this.
Right.
But in the film, as I discover and through my process of healing, I end up reading the case file. I find out that the back of her skull was smashed in, most likely with a hammer. So, and my mother's principal cause of death was suffocation, because when they found my mother's body, she had a plastic bag tied over her head. So my father had hit her in the back of the skull and tied a plastic, noosed her up with a plastic bag, and she suffocated to death. And my father denies this. And I even ask him, I say, well, how did she get the plastic bag over her head? He was like, oh, I put the plastic bag over her head. And I'm like, oh, okay. And he's like, oh, I put the plastic bag over her head because I didn't want her to look at me. I'm like, oh yeah, you didn't? While you were murdering her? Of course you didn't. So there's all these really just strange things that he has in his defense. So I guess the first time he was up for parole was in 2010. And I'd actually gone to the parole board and vouched for his release for two reasons. One is I wanted to curry favor with him because I wanted to tell this story. I'd always wanted to tell this story. And I knew that he wasn't getting out because there was a laundry list of people that were going against him. And I had no means for him to come live with me in California. I could barely take care of myself. He couldn't move in with me now. I don't have the ability to take care of someone else. And I just knew it wasn't possible. But I knew that it would curry favor with him because I wanted his participation to be able to tell this story. And so I would visit him in prison, and I would phone calls with him and stuff. And I had a very surface relationship with my father for 25, 26 years. I'm never really getting into the nitty gritty. When he was first up for parole, he did come to me. He did tell me that he was, quote, responsible for her death because his behavior led to my mother's murder. Because my father's always maintained is the one-armed man, or somebody else did it, or he's got all these theories. Like when he was in prison for years later, he was getting everyone riled up with theories that she was in a Chinese baby smuggling ring and gold smuggling ring and pedophile ring and selling sex slaves and just like crazy shit, QAnon type stuff, just so out there. And it's just obviously grabbing for straws. But So I don't know in the parole files what he actually has really said, but his story has always been maintained of that he's, quote, responsible for her death, that he pushed her, that it was an accident. And that's been the whole thing. Now, he didn't give that story at trial. He said she left. She got into a car and left. They got into the fight. She threw the purse out and the credit cards. No jacket, gets down the driveway and leaves, which was, of course, is a lie, right? So, and there was really no circumstantial evidence as far as like fingerprints and blood in his car, as far as I know. I did recently find out that that he had rented a cold storage for her body, and because he had given his ID so he could store the body while he dug her grave in the house.
Well, what about, I'm sorry, what about the girlfriend that signed for the house? I mean, I know that's, like identity kind of a, she had to know something was odd that she's signing for her. And, like she was never questioned. What was her?
Well, no, she was definitely questioned, and she took the fifth at the trial. And my father was going into business with her uncle, who was a chiropractor. They were going to do disability medicine, which is like workman's comp and things like that. That's what they were going to do together. And he was like a sketchy character from what I understood. But here's the thing is that she told me that she wrote Sherry Boyle because she thought they were going to get married. And he'd always told her that he was separated from my mother, and they were divorced and all this stuff. But when you're, she was 27, 28 years old when all this happened. When you're in a relationship with a narcissist and a manipulator, like, it's very easy to run mental gymnastics around someone, especially someone like her. And she just believed it, hook, line, and sinker. And she said that he came in before the real estate agent came back in, and he told her to put that N period initial in front. And she didn't really understand why, but she just did it. And so she was always under this impression that my father, I mean, for a long time, I had to sort of reconcile with the fact, like, did she know about my mother's murder? Because I blamed her in a lot of ways, because I was like, not that she caused my mother's murder and that she was a participant in it, but that she was guilty by association because my father was having this relationship with her. And that's why my mother was murdered in the first place, which isn't really true. My father is a psychopath, and she was also pregnant. So I have a half sister that was born 12 days before my father was arrested. And it's, she was in a position, and she thought like she had the whole world at her doorstep. She's going to marry this doctor. She's going to live this amazing life. She's going to start a new life. She had already been through a series of marriages or relationships that didn't work. She had 2 kids from those relationships or marriages. And she's going to marry a doctor. It's like the fairy tale for somebody, who's, from the Midwest. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to have this amazing life, right? And you hit the jackpot. The sad thing is that my father was also hitting the jackpot. He had a girlfriend that was 20 years younger than him. He's having a new baby. He's got all this money. He's getting ready to make. Somebody told me that my father was going to make $160,000 a year working 10 hours a week at this sort of consultation practice that he was doing in Erie, Pennsylvania. I mean, he had it made. And there was no reason to murder my mother. And if anyone, it would have been flipped, because my mother probably was the one who should have killed him, because he was winning the divorce, because he had all the money. He restricted her accounts and was controlling everything. But my father had supposedly told my mother, and this, I believe, came out in court, that he told my mother, "You're coming to Erie with me one way or another." And my father wanted to have his cake and eat it too, like any good narcissist, psychopath, sociopath does. And one of the things that, oh no, I lost my train of thought, but, but yeah, he was able to pull the wool over Sherry Campbell's eyes. Again, it took me a long time to sort of reconcile this and go, okay, she's not guilty. She's guilty by association.
Right.
Do I think that they helped plan my mother's murder? No. I think that my father is just so good at manipulating people and gaslight people that, I mean, he's a psychopath. And all of this was just literally premeditated and carefully thought out. And that's the difference between like narcissism and psychopathy or sociopathy. Psychopathy is it has a plan, and you're very calm, and it's very executed. It's very methodical. Jeffrey Dahmer is a psychopath. people like that, right? And my father's the same way.
Yeah.
So
I would say sociopaths get into a fight in a bar, and they immediately get into an argument. They immediately get into a fight. A psychopath just kind of says, "Oh, okay," he gets in his car, drives to a gas station, fills up a thing of gas, goes to your house, and burns it down with you and your family in it.
correct. Correct.
Both not good.
Both not good.
One
Both,
has a plan, though.
but one has a plan that's very methodical and very well executed. And that was my father. Now, the fault for all these personality disorders is there also is a massive degree of hubris that is involved with these types of personalities. Like, dumb cops will never figure this out. I can do whatever the fuck I want. You know what I mean? And that's what my father's attitude was. And ultimately, he got caught by an 11-year-old kid.
Right.
Because he was sloppy. And because I was determined. Because I knew what he did. And it's fucking wild, man, when I talk about it. And like I said, today, it's like been 33 years since I found out that she was murdered and he was arrested. And it was the trial of the century in my hometown. I mean, in Richland County, Ohio, it was just, I can't imagine, I think at the top of the conversation, you and I were bantering and we were talking about, crime. And you mentioned something like, oh, it takes years, sometimes these things. And I think now if this crime had been committed, there'd be every YouTuber and every TikToker talking about it, much like they're talking about the Idaho 4 and this Anna Walsh case and whatever the case is of the moment, right? And all these people speculating on forums and things. I think that would have been what was happening right now, and all this content be floating out there. And it'd probably be years before my father would be brought to trial, right? And now, as you know, the system is all about plea bargains and things of that nature. That's how they get people, right? So who knows? And he would have probably had higher power lawyers that would have done it pro bono just for the clout of the case and this, that, and the other. So there's, when I think about the timing of everything, it was a very swift justice that was dealt. My father was arrested January 25th. My father was convicted on June 25th.
So, so do you still speak with him?
I haven't spoken to him since around 2020, around the pandemic, because his prison was the one that was taken over by the National Guard in Ohio when the guards all got COVID. So it made international news. And so I had communicated with him to make sure he was okay. Also because my father and I share the same blood type. And I wanted, that was when COVID was out and everybody's talking about blood types and things like that. And I thought, okay, I'm asthmatic. Is he sick?
Right.
And he was quarantined. He had COVID, but he had no symptoms. I was like, okay. Hopefully I'm okay.
Okay.
But no, he's still incarcerated and fairly healthy for a 79-year-old guy who's been eating shitty prison food for 33 years.
Do you plan on,
Yeah. And I've been slowly contemplating, reaching out to him again. I mean, I have letters from him, recent letters. I had a stalker that just, I guess it would be almost a couple years ago now, January 2021. She was starting a pen pal relationship with him. And then she would send me her correspondence with him because I would ignore her.
Right.
So that was fun.
There are odd people out there.
There are odd people out there for sure. But it has been, I have spent my life trying to cope with all of this in a way that is healthy, in a way that is positive, and in a way that is, can affect change in the world. And I started a podcast last year, and it's called Moving Past Murder, and I share my personal story, and I talk about how these things relate to me. It's part true crime, part mental health, and I share my father's letters from prison. I talk to people. I play I have all these taped interviews that my father did from prison, 5 years after he was convicted, of him spouting these conspiracy theories. And I have new ones that have just come to surface. I find letters. I find people that reach out to me, and being abandoned by my whole family and having to grow up in foster care. And I was finally adopted after about a year. I was adopted by a really great family in the area. And they were strangers pretty much. But they had a very large family of brothers and sisters. So I had a lot of cousins. And that was a unique experience. And it was really challenging growing up with them in a lot of ways because they took on a kid I don't think they quite realized what they were getting into, but they just wanted to help. And, you know, we couldn't go anywhere without people knowing who I was. So they had this relative anonymity, and all of a sudden they adopt this kid, and it's a whole other thing. And they, you know, so that was a rough go for them growing up, but we have a wonderful relationship now, and we have for decades, you know.
Right.
And they've been very supportive and very understanding. And even, you know, I remember my adoptive father, George, I would get these letters from prison from my father, and he would break them down. And my father would be like manipulating me. He would say things like, "Oh, I really wish that I could have a filet of fish sandwich right now. I would give anything to have McDonald's." And he was like gaslighting me and or not gaslighting me, but trying to manipulate me to feel sorry for him because he's incarcerated. Because my father was always constantly working on, and probably still to this day would be working on, trying to have me rescind my testimony. He tried for years. And I even went as far as my father had hired a lawyer while he was incarcerated for an appeal, and had alleged all this new evidence that the body that was in the grave that they pulled out from the grave was not my mother's. So I gave permission to have that body exhumed, and when I was like 16 years old, 17 years old, and gave DNA testing to further prove that it was her, just to give my father a benefit of the doubt. Just for my own peace of mind, I wanted to know, like, is this real? And obviously it was her.
Yeah.
And then as far as coming to Los Angeles, becoming a filmmaker, because I was obsessed with telling the story and finding out, at the core of it was to find out why my father murdered my mother, and going as so far as enlisting a 2-time Oscar winner to direct this project, and then getting into the prison. And that was years of my life I spent going back to Ohio, seeing him in prison, getting to know the prison staff. They had a production facility in the prison where he's at now. And I would go into that facility. I would go into the actual prison and sit and teach them, because they had a production facility. I would teach them how to use editing software, and I would help them order cameras and show them how to shoot and show them how to do graphic design and teach inmates this. And then I would sit with my father, like not in the visitation room, and just chat with him, and then be teaching these people. And it was just to build this whole bond so I could get in there and be able to tell this story. It was really extraordinary to be able to do that, and very cathartic. And even though, you know, confronting my father and asking him, "Why did you murder my mother?" I ended up realizing that it was such a great discovery, because even though people were like, "Well, you didn't get your answer, you didn't get your why," I'm like, yeah, but I did get the answer. By telling me nothing, you tell me everything, because he's a psychopath. And I think that if my father had told me why, if he had said, "I murdered your mother because of X, Y, and Z," that would never be good enough, because I'd have even more questions. This way, I'm able to put it to bed in my mind and go, no, you're just you realize when you're talking to somebody like that, and this is who they are, that you realize that some people are just born evil. And my father's one of those people.
Yeah. I was going to say, if he owned up to it completely, you know, then there would actually be some atonement or you know, redemption there for him. And that's not who he is, because the person that does this doesn't ever want that. Does it make, you know what I'm saying? He's still trying, even to his dying breath. You know, maybe when he realizes, yeah, I'm not getting out of this, maybe he does it, but I doubt it. But, you know, to that, probably go to his grave saying, you know, the one-armed man.
Well, it was always like what he did say is, and then there's a story of the knife, and that comes out halfway in me confronting him. She came at me with the knife. I didn't know what to do. I'm like, with the knife? I want the knife. Yeah. What are we talking about here? The Golden Child? I'm just like, oh, okay. So where did this come from? So there's all these stories, and there's never going to be, you know, for him, there's never going to be, I murdered her because she was in the way of me starting a new life that I wanted. Or
I didn't want her to take a chunk of my money, the money I was going to be making.
But she wasn't even winning the divorce. That's the thing, is she wasn't going to take all this money. And even the police were like, she had more motive to kill him than he did her. He was going to get out of it and have money and a new family and a new life. My mother was the one who was going to suffer. I was going to be the one that was going to suffer. So she, you know, him committing this crime was not, is not logical, but we're not dealing with a logical person. And the fact that he just still has to have all these reasons and excuses just shows the psychopathy and everything behind me. Because at the core of this, he's a narcissist, he's a psychopath, and he's someone who it's their fault. It's what she did to me. She was going to divorce me. Yeah, dude, you impregnated another woman and you're going to go start a new, like, why would she be married to you? And we see this happen all the time, right? This is not something that's new, that these people behave like this. And they say, well, you know, and his comment of, you're going to come to Erie with me one way or another. She did. And my father ultimately wanted to be able to go down to that basement and look down and say, I fucking told you so, bitch, or whatever he was saying. You know, he wanted to know that she was right there beneath his feet. And that's a psychopath.
Right. So do you have a relationship with your stepsister?
So my half sister was well, but there's two, but it's totally fine. My half sister and I had a relationship up until when I made the documentary. She was going to participate, and then she decided not to. And I had offered both her and her mother a chance to be a part of it, and she was actually going to be a part of it. And I think her mother convinced her. And I don't think she did, to not do it. But I wanted Sherry to be able to tell her side of the story, so people didn't look at her and go, oh, well, you're at fault. And of course, giving people these opportunities, they don't take them. And then when something comes out, then they are looked at, or they're excoriated for their behavior. And then they're like, well, I didn't do this. And it's like, well, yeah, this is as my adopted parents told her, this is why Collier is trying to get you to participate, so you can tell your side of the story. So they chose not to do it. Then everybody's upset that people have an opinion about her. Well, guess what? You didn't tell your side of the story, and I gave you plenty of opportunity to do that. Exactly.
Listen, I have the same thing happen all the time. I contact people and then, you know, no, I don't want anything to do with it. Okay, well, then I always explain to it. Then you realize that somebody else, most likely law enforcement, will tell your side of the story. Well, they'll tell your story, and they're probably not going to do it the same justice or tell it from your perspective.
Yeah.
And then it comes out and they go, you made me sound this way, or you this, or they this, or that wasn't true. And well, you had a great opportunity to clear all of that up, you know? So it's so funny too, because sometimes it's like sometimes it's even minor. Like when I would read articles about myself, I would get all bent out of shape and upset over minor details. And of course, I was before I started writing. And now once I started writing, I was like, that's not a big deal. That's pretty accurate. I probably wouldn't have said it that way, but yeah, you know, and everybody. So I look back now and I think it's about 95% accurate. And the few things they got wrong were stupid. My Audi wasn't white. It was silver, you know? You know what I mean? It's just stupid. Like you don't know anything. My Audi was silver. Like, it's really not crucial. But
what's funny is, so when you make a film about your life, right? And I wasn't really supposed to be in it. I was going to be part of it, and I was going to be shooting it. And then we kind of called an audible at the last minute. And so I'm like, I look terrible. Like I'm wearing like set clothes type thing, like a fat grip, you know what I mean? But people were like, oh, what was the editing process like? And I work as a film editor, and I edit content, and I make movies and shit like that. But I was like, I didn't want to be any part of that process, because of course everything would come in vanity. So like what you were saying, like with the color of the audience, so there's all vanity things. Like I was like, oh, I look fat here. I sound stupid here. Like don't put this in. But it's like, that doesn't serve the narrative of the story. Like, and no one gives a fuck what color your Audi is. No one gives a shit about the sweatshirt that I was wearing. What they give a shit about is the content and what we're talking about, which is amazing in a lot of ways. But yeah, and sometimes these things can become a solipsistic endeavor. And I'm very grateful that that's not what this turned into, because it's a very powerful documentary. And it's not even true crime. I mean, I'm so new to this world of true crime, discovering all these people and seeing this whole sort of underbelly that exists. I mean, I was just working with a company with Vice doing this.
Well, where is the documentary?
So you can, the documentary is actually on my Patreon.
Okay.
But I made it with Investigation Discovery. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it on Hulu. But and Investigation Discovery has it, or Discovery Plus now. But it's also on my Patreon. If people go to my Patreon, you can just subscribe, and it's on there, and you can get a whole bunch of other content. I've got I've got letters from my father in prison. I do episodes of podcast ad free, and there's a player there. You can download all the episodes. I think I'm on episode 74. And there's a whole there's a bunch of content on there that sort of shows my life and a lot more of the stuff that I'm doing. And but yeah, that's where they can find the documentary.
So you just said you have the episodes on Patreon, but do you have your episodes on your YouTube?
Yeah, so I have episodes on my YouTube, and I do ad-free ones on Patreon. But yeah, so my YouTube, everyone can find me at my website, which is collierlandry.com. You can find me on TikTok, Instagram, wherever, at Collier Landry. And you can join my Patreon through there. But everything is on my website, the podcast, because my podcast is called Moving Past Murder, which was something that I started as a continuation of what the documentary was, which was, I made the documentary. I made that because I was very, very passionate about growing up, that when we looked at cases, because I had, from my own personal experience, the bad guy goes to jail, the victim is dead, the state gets this restitution, the gavel hits, and we say, next, like, what's next, right? Like, next case. And we never examine the consequences of violence, the consequences of communities, on ancillary victims, friends of the victim, family members of the perpetrator, and what it's like. And also to expose, like, this is what it's like to not only have your mother murdered, but having it done by your father. So you're both the son of the victim and the perpetrator. There's not a lot of people that are in this world that can experience that and talk about it. So I made the film to show that, and to show what healing is like, but also I do that further in the podcast, Moving Past Murder, to show my process of going through all this. Like I said, it's part true crime, part mental health, and it's me exposing things that I go through. And I do it on TikTok too, but the podcast is a way to really find me.
What, on YouTube or just?
Yeah, it's on YouTube. It's on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get the podcast from.
Yeah. How often are you posting?
So I do a new episode every week.
Okay.
Every Friday, new episode comes out of Moving Past Murder. Yeah. I have a new podcast I'm starting called Survivor Squad. We're just getting ready to release, which I co-host with Tara Newell from Dirty John.
How is it getting guests? Like,
so I have a sort of mixture. I reach out to people, or people come to me. They've seen the film, they've watched the podcast, they've seen the story, and I have so many people. One of the things that is really powerful about making something and being so vulnerable is that vulnerability and authenticity really resonates with people. And so I get messages out the woodwork of people who have seen the film, who've listened to the podcast, that it has resonated with. They've just said, thank you so much for telling your story, because it has helped me so much in my own personal journey of healing, because I never got justice, or I'm a victim of sexual assault. Unfortunately, a lot of these people are victims of child sexual abuse that reach out to me, because they haven't healed from that trauma. The adverse childhood effects, the ACEs as they call it. And they say to me, watching you do this, first of all, they're horrified by what happened to me, and they're like, well, what I do, what has happened to me pales in comparison to you. And I'm like, well, yeah, but it's not a contest. It's not a contest, right? It's like everyone's trauma affects them only uniquely. Like, no, like, yeah, my shit is so horrific, but like, that's the exception, not the rule. That doesn't discount the way that somebody's been through their own trauma. But I'm so glad that the message helps them and helps them heal and get on that journey and feel reassured of that journey that they're on to heal themselves, because that's a really powerful thing. And I know my mother would love that I was doing that for people. So it's been a really amazing journey. But as far as guests, just people reach out to me. They say, I'd love to be on the program. And or I reach out to like you, I reach out to them and I say, hey, I'd love to have you on the podcast, you know, and I think people have interesting stories. And I like to, you know, like I said, it's true crime, mental health, but I'm trying to steer away from necessarily true crime as this, you know, not the salaciousness of it all. It's more of, I want to talk to people who've been through extraordinary circumstances, because we've all experienced trauma. We all have. If you were born before 2020, we have all experienced some sort of trauma with COVID. Right? That's a traumatic event that the world experienced, unless you live in a cave in Afghanistan or something like that. So we all have had to deal with certain tremendous circumstances in our life, or extraordinary circumstances in our life, and how to come through and build resilience. And, you know, I tell people all the time, I say, you know, it's not what you've been through that defines you. And this is what I aim to show through all the work that I do, is it's not what you've been through that defines you. It's what you take from that and what you do next that defines you. And some people can go through, you know, I had a psychologist tell me once, she goes, you know, you're the outlier. If you were sitting under a bridge in East LA with a needle in your arm saying, fuck the world, no one would blame you. You have every right to do that, but you don't live that way. And, you know, there are people that can just literally take this up and they're angry. They hate the world. This injustice happened to them. They've been through all this trauma. They bottle it up inside. They say, fuck the world. It's not fair. I'm just getting, and they can be, they self-harm. They harm others. They continue the cycle of abuse, not only on themselves, but others. Or you can take that and you can say, I've been through this shit, and I'm not going to let this affect those around me negatively. I'm going to turn it into a positive. And look, I'm up here talking about this. I'm far from a perfect person. Absolutely. But I am someone who I feel can look themselves in the mirror every day and go, I've done the best I can. The best I could. Did the best I could when I was younger to honor my mother and carry that through my life and try to be positive. But I'm also a perpetual optimist, which I found out was a trait my mother had. So it's apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
Yeah, I was going to say it's definitely perspective. Yeah,
life is
you're not going to use it as a crutch to fail for the rest of your life. No. You know, but listen, so many people do.
Yeah,
so many people do.
I mean, look what you're doing. You're literally taking something that is. I mean, granted, it was something of your own creation, but still, you could also. I mean, how many people come out of prison and reoffend? You know, recidivism is a real thing. Yeah, you know, and you chose. Yeah, exactly.
Fraud is actually the highest recidivism rate, higher than
drugs.
Yeah, murder is the lowest.
Yeah,
yeah, because if most of them get out and they never reoffend. That, you know, it's usually very circumstantial and you know, of course, they're under the microscope the rest of their life, and you know, so. You know, very few people they actually get out and commit a murder again. I mean, they're out there, but very seldom does that happen.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the people that get out.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And then there's, you know, then drugs, then, you know, so it keeps going. But yeah, fraud's the worst.
Interesting.
You know, especially because the people that commit fraud have such psychological problems. Like it is all just, it's narcissism and just straight arrogance, and it's so hard to know how to easily manipulate the system and then not do it because you're so desperate to prove how smart you are, you know, which is also why most people get caught. You know, it's hard to just shut your mouth, like commit the crime, shut your mouth. It's not really so much about the money as it is about letting everybody know how smart I am.
Interesting.
So then you get caught. Well, there you go. Stupid. Like the same thing that gave you the guts to pull it off is the same thing that is your detriment.
Yeah.
You know, which was definitely, definitely my undoing was that I just allowed, just shot my mouth off, allowed too many people to know what was going on and included too many people and was not, nearly as careful. And, it just kept caught up with me and caught up with me and caught up with me, and then of course, every time I got lucky and got away with it, I just became more brazen. I didn't get away with it because I was lucky. I got away with it because I was just that good. Like once again, like, oh, this is bad. This is bad. You just got lucky. Walk away. No, I'm just that good. Oh, okay. And so I thought I was pretty clever right up until the judge said, yeah,
You're not so clever, buddy. No,
not that clever.
Yep. My YouTube channel is youtube.com/Collier Landry. My podcast is called Moving Past Murder. I post new episodes every Friday on YouTube and on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast from. I also create individual content for YouTube Shorts, and on my YouTube channel, I'm offering a membership soon. You can find all things Collier Landry at www.collierlandry.com. I have a large TikTok following as well. Find me on TikTok at Collier Landry. Everything is at Collier Landry. So check it out, and thanks for having me, man.